He was a successful entrepreneur with a big heart.
He was just very business savvy.
He received an award for his services helping the community.
Everybody loved him. Everybody. He was just a spirit you wanted to be around.
And she seemed like the perfect match for his caring spirit.
She was a successful mental health counselor.
He found her unique, found her beautiful.
Their goals for the future were really aligned, and so there was so much more than just a physical connection there.
But a shocking disappearance tears this picture-perfect family apart.
I was calling my dad. The phone was going to voicemail. She's not answering either. None of the kids are answering. Could they have been kidnapped? Could they have been killed?
The search for answers reveals a gruesome discovery.
They lifted up the cover and just dropped it.
The television was on a true crime show at full volume, like a taunt to the police. It was scary.
He never saw this coming.
Or were the warning signs there all along?
I heard something about a divorce.
He was checked out. He was done.
It became very obvious through their communications that they were having an extramarital affair.
Yeah, it's crazy. Just something about her just wasn't right. She been a terror.
Hey, Mickey!
This was diabolical. This was premeditated.
I was just pissed. I was livid. I was angry. The situations that she put us in, just wicked.
March 19th, 2018. It's a sunny spring day in the laid-back Houston suburb of Spring, Texas.
Spring, Texas, that's where you go when you want to escape the city. It's a great place to raise a family.
It's about 30 miles north of Houston proper, and it has a lot of trees, so it gives like a rural vibe, like a suburb vibe.
And unlike its neighboring metropolitan areas, Spring is renowned for its low crime rates.
I would categorize Spring as a relatively safe area. It's very residential.
Spring is a quiet area. You don't hear a whole lot about crime.
But at 6 p.m., one family is beginning to panic.
51-year-old Mickey Willis's family hadn't heard from him in 10 days. He had missed some really important family events, and that just wasn't like him.
So Mickey's father, A.W. Willis, decides to check the rental home where Mickey lives.
The landlord actually went out there with A.W. to get him access to the house.
Thanks again for doing this.
Of course. I just hope he's okay.
But immediately upon opening the front door, it's clear something's wrong.
That's when they smell the foul odor.
We can't go in there. Something's wrong. I'm calling the police.
Yes.
Now, they were really faring the worst.
Police are at the scene within minutes.
So when police got in there, they don't see anything alarming. They don't see clothes thrown everywhere or any scene that would look like there was a disturbance. But what they did notice audibly was that they could hear the TV still playing. So they go up to the room, the bedroom where the TV was playing.
The smell got worse and worse as they made their way up to the bedroom.
The television was on a true crime show at full volume, like a taunt to the police. It was scary.
It looked like there was someone lying under the blanket on the bed.
Officers cautiously approach and are taken aback by what they discover.
They lifted up the cover and just dropped it.
They found Mickey lying on the bed, and he was in an advanced stage of decomposition, so he had been dead for quite a while.
He was literally decomposing and rotting and had flesh flies literally feeding on his body.
We need homicide immediately.
It was like something out of a horror movie. How did this happen to Mickey?
Eric Mickey Willis was known across Texas for his unmatched wit and humor.
My dad was very comical. He just was a jokester. He always laughed, smiled, found some kind of humor in any situation, basically.
He was an amazing father, even though the relationships with the mothers of his children did not work out.
Like, me and my dad, we were really tight. I would, talk to him all the time, call him on the phone. All the time. Whenever I had something good going on, he was the first person I called.
Mickey was also known as a jack of all trades.
My dad has always been an entrepreneur. He was a hardworking man.
He dabbled in the music industry. He raced horses. As a matter of fact, he had 3 award-winning horses.
He was also a certified auto mechanic.
He loved cars. He liked fast cars. So I guess he just liked racing. I guess you can put it like that. Maybe he liked the fast life.
Mickey's most recent endeavor was opening his own demolition company.
His business was pretty successful because of the innovating ideas Mickey brought to the table.
He found a way to smash the trash where he would compact it even tighter to get more trash in one load because you got to pay to dump. He was just very business savvy.
But despite his dedication to the grind, Mickey always went the extra mile when it came to helping others.
He was selfless. He cared about other people. He would volunteer his company's services during Hurricane Harvey, and he always was assisting with the Houston Fire Department, so much so that he received an award from them for his services and how he was helping them and helping the community.
Everybody loved him. Everybody. He was just a spirit you wanted to be around.
So it was never difficult for Mickey to find a date.
He was definitely a ladies' man. He was very handsome, and the ladies were very attracted to him.
You see pictures of him he was a smooth guy.
He created a lot of relationships with his charm. He had a few other women, but then the next one that we actually to know and meet was Cynthia.
Hey, Mickey. What's your name?
Cynthia.
Cynthia.
He was just really taken aback by her beauty when he met her. He found her unique, found her beautiful.
From the get-go, they both had something to relate to, and that was their desire for a big family.
Actually, I have 4 kids, all girls.
All girls?
Yep.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's a trip, but they're amazing.
I would actually love to be a part of a big family like that.
Oh, really?
Yes.
They quickly found that their goals for the future were really aligned, and so there was so much more than just a physical connection there.
Before long, the couple decided to take the fast track to making their hopes and dreams a reality.
They ended up going to Vegas and eloping there. They didn't even tell us.
And back in Spring, Texas, their union continued to blossom.
Cynthia had a great job. She worked at a local behavioral therapy center.
She was a successful mental health counselor. Her income combined with Mickey's demolition business allowed them to live comfortably while continuing to build their family.
Together, they had 3 kids.
But now, Mickey has been found deceased in the couple's bedroom. And based on the state of decomposition, he's been there for quite some time.
At this point, the decomposition was at least 10 days. And this is a gruesome scene.
Detectives turn off the television, which has been eerily projecting a true crime series, and get to work examining Mickey's body.
Despite the advanced state of decomposition, investigators are able to determine how Mickey died. He was shot on the left side of his head behind his ear.
There was a spent casing from a 9mm weapon laying on the pillow next to him. It was fairly obvious that it was an execution-style shooting as he slept.
He never saw this coming.
As shocking as the discovery of Mickey's body is, there's an important question on everyone's mind. Where is Cynthia?
Still no sign of the wife.
After seeing Mickey's body, police are concerned about Cynthia and the children.
The couple lived in the home with their 2 adult children and the youngest son who was about to graduate high school.
Could they have been kidnapped? Could they have been killed?
Police could only hope there weren't going to be multiple victims in this crime.
51-year-old Eric Mickey Willis had a successful demolition business and a large, loving family, with his wife Cynthia by his side.
He was always laughing, joking around. He was just always happy.
However, the house that was once filled with love and laughter is now swarming with police.
Mickey had been fatally shot on the left side of his head, and his body was terribly decomposed.
But where is Mickey's wife, Cynthia?
Still no sign of the wife?
Put out an APB out on the car.
Yes, sir.
The couple lived in the home with their 2 adult children and the youngest son, who was about to graduate high school.
Could they have been kidnapped? Could they have been killed?
Police only hope there aren't multiple victims in this crime.
When investigators check the doors and windows, they don't find any signs of forced entry.
We had ruled out any type of home invasion, any type of a planned hit from outside.
Whoever did this either had a key to the home or they were let in by somebody.
As investigators put out a bolo for Cynthia Willis and her car, the tragic news of Mickey's death spreads to the rest of the family.
I gotta tell you something.
I remember my grandfather called me to tell me that they found your dad in the house over there. And I just broke down. Toya called me and she said, they found a body in the house. And I just remember screaming. I just screamed. I just fell on the floor and I just kept screaming that, we waited too late. We waited too late to call and to check.
If we would have pushed the issue a little bit further, could we have found him sooner? It was just so many questions. It was guilt, it was anger. It was a lot of emotions that we were all feeling.
Mr. Willis?
I gotta call you back.
A.W. Willis is still reeling from his son's death, but he wants to help investigators in any way that he can.
So when was the last time you talked to him?
A.W. says no one in the family had heard from Mickey for 10 days.
Okay, and do they all live in Houston?
Yes.
My sister Erica, she was pregnant. She had my nephew March 12th, and I was calling my dad, and I was trying to tell him, Erica's in labor. The phone was going to voicemail. In my head, I thought, well, maybe him and the kids and Cynthia took a trip because it was spring break.
So we said, okay, well, let's give it some time. We just kind of started making up things in our head to make us ease ourselves.
But the family's concern escalated the following Monday.
So Monday comes by, and that's when we find out that he didn't show up to work. So we're like, okay, that's kind of odd because he was very hardworking. Like, he worked around the clock. He wouldn't just abandon a job like that.
He had never not showed up for work. I mean, he was just a guy that was faithful to his word.
A.W. says the family's next step was to contact Cynthia.
I dialed the Cynthia number about 11 or 12 times, right after another. Nothing but a voicemail.
He tried calling his grandchildren who still lived in the home, but they weren't answering either.
And I'm concerned about all of them, not just him, because I couldn't reach anybody.
A.W. says that's when the family decided to reach out to Mickey's landlord.
We reached out to the landlord and kind of insisted, like, hey, we want you to go out there, check, and open the house.
Detectives inquire about the relationship between Mickey and Cynthia.
Did he say anything was wrong?
Well, they've been having some domestic problems.
And according to A.W., Mickey seemed to be at the end of his rope.
That's what he told me. He wanted out. And I heard something about a divorce.
He was checked out. He was done.
Detectives in Spring, Texas, investigating the murder of 51-year-old Mickey Willis, are speaking with his devastated father, A.W.
According to Mickey's father, Mickey and his wife Cynthia had been going through a rough patch lately.
Well, they've been having some domestic problems. He put it out, and I heard something about a divorce.
My dad was checked out. He was done.
But did Mickey ever go through with the separation? A.W. doesn't have an answer to that question.
He wasn't sure if his son had filed for divorce, but he knew it had weighed on him heavily.
You know, people tell you things, you don't go off and tell everybody because you don't know the truth.
This was a 30-year relationship that was very rocky. They would fight quite frequently.
There were issues in Cynthia and Mickey's relationship for years.
You know what it was about?
And that's been for years, you know.
He said they was having problems, but he didn't tell you what kind of problems.
Well, some of the problems they had was so obvious, you know. You could see him being hurt, you know, hit, things of that nature.
Hitting?
A.W. says the fights between Mickey and Cynthia sometimes escalated into physical violence.
You know that he's been hit. Like
by her?
Yeah.
I've had it, Cynthia.
You don't think I've had it too?
I don't know if they reported that. He was trying to protect the girl, you know. He loved the girl, that was his kid, he loved her.
And A.W. says shortly before Mickey went missing, he and his wife got a phone call from Cynthia that made them believe she was trying to mend her relationship with their son.
She called my wife, and she was saying, well, I'm gonna try to do better. And my wife said, well, we love you, but you need to try to give your husband respect. And
Cynthia said that she had done a lot of things wrong, but she was trying to do better. She was going to fix things, and she was going to make this marriage work.
But did their marital woes just drive them further and further apart?
Based on what investigators were hearing, they started to wonder if those marriage problems could have driven Cynthia to do something.
Maybe she wasn't another victim in this crime. Maybe she did this.
And I don't think he got the respect from the young lady, and they never has, in the sense.
But as police continue searching the entire Houston metropolitan area for Cynthia, detectives make a valuable discovery in Mickey's text messages.
As they go through those phone records, investigators see that Mickey has been communicating with a woman named Jackie Caldwell.
When detectives dig deeper, they uncover near constant communication between the two, starting in the weeks leading up to Mickey's murder.
Jackie was a childhood friend of Mickey. They grew up together and lost contact, but then reconnected.
It became very obvious through their communications that they were having an extramarital affair.
In the text messages, detectives can see that Mickey and Jackie had a date planned for the evening of March 9th.
So she's with him. They're spending time together the night before he gets murdered.
If Mickey was planning to patch things up with Cynthia, did he let Jackie know that night?
Did Mickey go meet with Jackie that night to break things off with her?
To get to the bottom of this, detectives call in Jackie for questioning.
All right, Ms. Caldwell, we need you to be honest with us.
This might be a classic case of a woman scorned.
Detectives investigating the murder of 51-year-old Mickey Willis have just brought his lover, Jackie Caldwell, in for questioning.
Mickey's wife, Cynthia, and their 3 adult children are still missing.
Could Jackie have something to do with it?
Detectives know from reviewing Mickey's text messages that he was on a date with Jackie just hours before he was killed. But according to Mickey's father, Mickey and his wife Cynthia were planning on patching up their relationship.
Did Mickey go meet with Jackie that night to break things off with her?
All right, Ms. Caldwell, we need you to be honest with us.
This might be a classic case of a woman scorned.
But Jackie appears heartbroken by Mickey's death.
She seems genuinely upset that he's gone.
Detectives ask Jackie about the texts they found on Mickey's phone, and she readily admits that they were involved in a romantic relationship.
It's true. I was with him Friday night. We had dinner together.
The last time she saw him was at dinner on March 9th.
Jackie, did something happen that night? Did y'all get into a fight?
Absolutely not.
So there was no mention of a breakup?
Not at all. Him and his wife were the ones breaking up, not us. We were in love.
She told the officers that she loved him, that he was not breaking up with her, but that they were actually planning to go away together after Mickey's divorce.
Jackie says that Mickey was dead set on them being together, that it was only a matter of him filing for divorce and leaving his wife.
It's why we got together for dinner, to celebrate the start of our new relationship. He was finally leaving his wife.
And you have no idea where she is now?
No.
But is Jackie telling the truth?
It became a who's who in this situation, and they had to do some more investigating to determine what really happened.
In their search for answers, investigators turned to Mickey's inner circle of friends.
During the course of their investigation, investigators interviewed one of Mickey's best friends and co-workers named Lamar Banks.
He tells police that he and Mickey have been friends for years. They even worked together in construction.
Sit there, so we talk every day, talk all the time.
Because they were so close, Mickey confided in him a number of things that he had not disclosed to anyone else.
He really was in love with Jackie and wanted to divorce Cynthia to start a life with her. According to Lamar, the situation with Cynthia was far worse than anyone realized, even Mickey's close family members.
That's crazy. Just something about her just wasn't right. And she been a terror for the last past 30 years, man, that I've known her.
He witnessed a toxic relationship of constant arguing and a lot of physical assaults that took place where Cynthia was assaulting Mickey.
She swapped him.
But he had no idea how bad it was until one day when he was dropping off Mickey at home.
Thanks for the ride, man. I appreciate it.
We'll see you tomorrow.
All right, we'll get with you.
All right.
Took him home, and we pulled in the driveway. I'm sitting my phone, so I'm see somebody come out the corner, y'all.
It was Cynthia, and she had a knife.
Mickey trying to go in the front door, and she come around the side, on the other side of the garage, and she had a butcher knife. I look, I say, Mickey, blowing the horns at Mickey. I see she come.
Hey, Mickey!
Texas detectives are speaking with Lamar Banks, the best friend of murder victim Eric Mickey Willis.
Lamar said Mickey's relationship with his wife Cynthia had become more and more violent, and Cynthia even came at him with a knife.
Blowing horns, Mickey. See, she come.
Hey, Mickey!
But it was too late.
When he turned around, man, she hit him. She hit him with that knife in his arm or his shoulder. He said that damn blade come out at the back of him.
So Cynthia stabbed him in the shoulder?
Oh, hell yeah, she done stabbed him, man. She done stabbed him, and hell yeah.
Lamar says he immediately tried to help his friend.
And I was reaching for my pistol in the console. I said, I'm gonna shoot that.
But Mickey told Lamar he didn't need his help.
He said, now. They grabbed him, and they go in the house. And he shut the door.
Mickey was a family man to his core, and he didn't want to do anything that would break up the family.
Mickey was a person that where his kids was more important to him than what Cynthia was doing to him. He was a family man, the way he was raised.
At that time, like, he didn't press charges or he didn't want her to go to jail or anything like that.
But once the couple's youngest son was nearing his high school graduation, Mickey was ready for a new life and a new relationship.
He said, this boy here finna get ready to finish school. And I'm done. I'm gone.
It was kind of one of the situations like, I'm just going to stay with her till these kids get out of here and graduate and become adults, and then I'll plan my escape.
Never known her to own a gun or anything.
I don't know what Vicky was shot with, but that's what she keep on the gun. Keep that right in her purse.
It's a shocking revelation about the esteemed mental health counselor.
With every new discovery, Cynthia looks more and more capable of committing murder, and police are becoming more and more concerned about the welfare of the children.
So they're looking at this and seeing like, okay, there is the capacity that she could also harm her own children. So time is of the essence, and they were really trying hard to find not only Cynthia, but the children.
But they still have no idea where they could be found.
However, when they subpoena Cynthia's cell phone records, investigators finally get a lead on her whereabouts.
So using the GPS information from the cell phones, detectives were able to track down the night of the murder. Cynthia left that home and traveled to a hotel in Spring, Texas.
Not long after, it's tracked to a home in Humble, Texas. That's about 30 miles from the Willis's residence.
Property records show that the home belongs to Cynthia's sister.
Investigators race to the home, fearing the worst, but instead, they're met with relief.
Can I help you?
The couple's 3 kids are safe and sound.
Is your mother, Cynthia, here? No. Why?
Cynthia is nowhere to be found.
Everyone in the home is clearly worried and confused, including Cynthia's sister.
When Cynthia asked to stay with her for a while, she didn't think much of it.
The entire time they've been here, it has been very normal. Very normal.
Did you talk to your sister about what's going on? Where's Eric?
We're not, I assume, either they were, again, separated, and left again, and I didn't ask questions. We're not super close.
Cynthia's sister says she was at the house last night, but no one has seen or heard from her since.
And I have not talked to Cynthia.
When detectives reveal that Mickey is now dead, the family members are stunned.
This is the first I'm hearing about my dad being gone.
Mickey's daughter says the last time she saw him was March 9th, after he was home from his date with Jackie.
My dad got home probably about 12:30, a little after midnight. It was a normal night. My dad came in, he was tired.
You still up?
Yeah, you know how us night owls do.
I talked to him for a little bit, and then he went to his room, we went to sleep.
Good night, sweetheart.
All right, Dad.
Love you.
I love you too.
But early the next morning, her mother seemed panicked.
My mom woke us up Saturday morning and said we were leaving. I don't remember what time, maybe 7, but it was early. She woke us up.
Wake up. Wake up now. We gotta go. What's going on? I'll explain to you later. Come on, we gotta go. We gotta go. Come on.
She didn't give them any options of taking clothing or toothbrushes or anything like that. She rushed them all out of the house and they left.
They just assumed their parents had gotten into another fight, and that's why they were leaving the house.
They argue a lot. I mean, I guess it was getting worse, but we didn't really pay that no mind. It was just our new normal.
What happened then?
She said we were going to my mom's house. And then we been here ever since. My mom said we couldn't go back home.
But the siblings say that on the night of the murder, none of them heard a gunshot go off.
And you didn't hear any scuffling, you didn't hear any noise?
I didn't.
Between the time you went to bed and she woke you up?
I didn't hear loud. I didn't really hear anything.
Could Cynthia have used the television in the bedroom to drown out any noise?
When the officers got there, the television was on and it was turned up loud. It was true crime stories that were on the TV at the time Mickey was killed. And so you start to wonder, was she trying to acclimate the environment, those others who were in the home, to the sounds of gunshots? Was that part of her plan? And it seems like it was.
Cynthia's youngest son, 17-year-old Eric Jr., echoes his sister's claims.
So he talks about how, everything seemed normal the night before. The next morning, the mother rushes him out of the home.
But he adds another crucial piece of information.
According to Eric, the day after they moved into his aunt's house, his mom made a chilling statement.
She said something really messed up, man.
What did she say?
She said that she hurt him real bad.
She said it was out of self-defense, that Mickey tried to hurt her and she was only protecting herself.
He never thought his mom had hurt his dad so bad that she'd killed him.
I mean, they fight all the time. I just thought it was another fight.
But now Eric Jr. feels confident that his mom is a killer, and his siblings agree.
She killed him. She killed our dad.
Whenever a child gives up that kind of information that implicates one of their own parents in a murder, that's something you have to take seriously.
All three of Cynthia's children agreed to cooperate with the investigation and gave detailed statements.
They've got what they need to put together a murder case on Cynthia.
But they still have to find her.
For Mickey's loved ones, the waiting game is hard to stomach.
I was just pissed. I was livid. I was angry. And it's just like, why can't y'all find this lady? Because where is she and when is she going to jail? I was very, very upset because why are you hiding now?
Finally, on March 24th, police get the tip they've been waiting for.
They get a tip that Cynthia may be at an apartment complex down close to Pearland, Texas, which is further south of downtown.
And fortunately for investigators, the tip pays off.
They pull her over during a traffic stop and they arrest her.
She's taken in without incident.
From there, she's transported to Harris County for an interview with detectives.
When investigators take her in for questioning, what's interesting about this whole dynamic is she is mum. She doesn't say anything. She doesn't admit to anything, confess, but she also doesn't deny.
Instead, after she's read her Miranda rights, she asks for an attorney.
Even without a confession, investigators have what they need to charge Cynthia with first-degree murder.
Cynthia's 3 kids all agreed to testify against their mother in court. That alone was a huge win for prosecutors.
But a tragic twist of fate will turn the case on its head.
Eric Jr. was shot to death in a similar fashion to his father.
He had been murdered 2 weeks before his dad's case went to trial.
Investigators preparing for the murder trial of 48-year-old Cynthia Willis have just learned that one of their key witnesses has been killed.
Eric Jr. was shot to death in a similar fashion to his father.
He had been murdered 2 weeks before his dad's case went to trial.
Everyone's first thought was, did Cynthia have something to do with this?
We were all like, she killed him. Like, that was the first thought, because we knew that he was a key witness.
However, that theory is soon discounted.
It turned out Eric was senselessly killed by a fellow classmate he did not get along with. The young man was sentenced to 50 years in prison.
It's unfortunate that little Eric passed, but he was saved from that trauma of having to testify in some way.
In August of 2021, nearly 3.5 years after Mickey's death, Cynthia goes on trial for murder.
Based on Cynthia and Mickey's prior domestic violence incidents, prosecutors outline a violent and abusive relationship.
They painted a picture of a very narcissistic person, a controlling person, and a bully.
Over the prior 2 decades, Cynthia proved herself capable of rage and violence time and time again.
She abused him throughout the relationship. She committed an aggravated assault on Mickey by stabbing him in the shoulder. That showed her propensity for violence.
Prosecutors contend that on the day Mickey Willis was murdered, Cynthia's rage finally reached its peak.
They had text messages that proved Cynthia knew Mickey was planning to divorce her and start a new relationship with Jackie.
The most dangerous time for a victim of domestic abuse is when they're trying to leave the relationship.
Her violence and her rage and her anger could not handle the idea of Mickey having the nerve to leave her. She felt like if she couldn't have him, then no one else could.
On the evening of March 9th, Cynthia decided to put her plan into action.
So I don't believe that Cynthia snapped. I believe that she thought about this for some time.
This was diabolical. This was premeditated.
She turned up the TV to mask the sound of the gunshot.
Cynthia pulled out the gun and shot him in the back of the head, so he had no idea what was happening.
He didn't have a chance to say goodbye to anybody. And she killed him in a space where you're supposed to feel the most safe, in your bed in your room.
That morning, when the reality of what she'd done began to sink in, Cynthia started to panic.
And that's why she rushed the kids out of the home, didn't really have a game plan. The kids didn't even have clothes or belongings. And it speaks to just how messy the whole situation was.
Prosecutors lay out a convincing argument. However, a shocking curveball threatens to derail the entire case.
Before trial, the couple's daughter gave prosecutors a sworn statement regarding her mother's violent past and the abuse that occurred.
And so we hoped that she would be cooperative on the stand. But then when she took the stand, it was the complete opposite. She started saying, I don't remember, I don't recall, I didn't say that.
We would ask her a question. She would answer it in a way that she apparently thought was favorable to her mother. I remember points during her testimony when I was fighting back tears in my eyes because you could see a daughter who is trying to stand up for her mother, who is staring daggers at her from counsel table where she's seated.
Prosecutors call out the inconsistencies during cross-examination.
We already had a prior sworn statement from her in our back pocket, and so when she would deny making that prior sworn statement, the statement would come into evidence.
The jury knew. The jury knew she was lying.
And looking back on it now, I realized that that was the day that we won the case.
After a week-long trial, jurors returned with a verdict. They find Cynthia guilty of the murder of her husband.
I remember when they said guilty, Stephanie was sitting next to me, I just grabbed her hand, I started crying. I mean, I hadn't cried many times through that proceeding, and I cried then because we made it.
Watching the trial, I was relieved because a lot of people in these type of situations always have a little bit more sympathy for the woman.
During sentencing, Cynthia continues to profess her innocence.
She took absolutely no responsibility. When she finally had her opportunity to speak on her own behalf, she wanted to try to throw Mickey under the bus.
She said, I was the victim, that Mickey had cheated on her throughout their marriage. She talked about how he hung out with very suspicious people. And so she was just continuing to kind of dog his character and really speak down on him.
Regardless, the jury has little sympathy for the former mental health counselor.
The jury sentenced her to 50 years in prison.
A 50-year sentence for Cynthia means that she will not be eligible for parole until August of 2047. And at that time, she'll be 77 years old. So this pretty much is a life sentence.
Was it enough to say, you know, I feel completely satisfied? No, but, you know, it would do for now.
This was a case, obviously, of domestic violence that got out of hand. There's no question that Cynthia had been physically abusing Mickey all those years.
I mean, this is someone whose job was counseling others about their mental health, and then she turned around and killed her husband. It really shows that this can happen to anybody.
For men, I know it's difficult to admit that,
you're getting abused, but it's okay. Just because she's a woman doesn't mean it's okay for her to be verbally abusive or physically abusive. So my advice is get out while you can, because it's not gonna get any better.
My dad just was a very loving, caring, giving person.
And had it been what my daddy would have wanted, we all would have been a big, happy family. So we cremated him. Everybody's got a little mini urn. Everybody's got a necklace or a bracelet. So he's actually truly getting to spend the amount of time he wants with all his family as much as he wants to. He's everywhere with everybody.
On the morning of April 1st, SIL 1988, 8-year-old April Marie Tinsley left her home in Fort Wayne, Indiana, expecting an ordinary spring day. It was Good Friday. School was closed for the Easter holiday, and children throughout the neighborhood spent the morning riding bicycles, visiting friends, and enjoying the first signs of warmer weather after another Midwestern winter. Nothing about that morning suggested it would become one of the darkest days in Indiana's criminal history. April lived with her family in a neighborhood where children often played outside together. Friends and neighbors later described the area as the kind of community where families recognized one another. Children walked between nearby homes, and the ordinary routines of daily life created a sense of security. It was precisely that sense of normalcy that made what happened next so profoundly unsettling. At approximately mid-morning, April left home to visit friends who lived only a short distance away. The trip was familiar. She was wearing casual clothing appropriate for the mild spring weather and expected to return home later that day. There was no indication that she believed she was in danger. According to investigators, her planned destination was close enough that her absence initially raised little concern. It was the kind of errand thousands of children completed safely every day. As the hours passed, however, something became wrong. Family members realized that April had not returned when expected. Relatives and neighbors began looking for her throughout the neighborhood, checking the homes of friends, nearby streets, parks, and familiar places where children commonly gathered. As afternoon turned into evening, the search became increasingly urgent. What had begun as concern over a child who was running late quickly evolved into fear that something far more serious had occurred. Law enforcement officers from the Fort Wayne Police Department responded rapidly after April was reported missing. Officers interviewed family members, spoke with neighbors, and attempted to reconstruct the final confirmed movements of the 8-year-old girl. The detectives established a timeline based upon witness accounts and searched the area surrounding her neighborhood for any indication of where she might have gone. The disappearance immediately presented investigators with difficult questions. There were no confirmed reports of April leaving the area voluntarily. No evidence suggested that she had planned to travel beyond the neighborhood. Detectives examined whether she might have accepted a ride from someone she knew or encountered an unknown individual while walking between locations she visited regularly. Every possibility required investigation because the first hours after a child disappears are often the most critical. As darkness fell over Fort Wayne, the search expanded. Police officers, firefighters, volunteers, and local residents searched streets, wooded areas, drainage ditches, vacant lots, and nearby fields. Search teams called April's name repeatedly, hoping she might answer if she had become lost or injured. Families throughout the community joined the effort, believing that the missing child could still be found alive. Instead, each passing hour deepened uncertainty. News of the disappearance spread quickly through local media. Television stations interrupted regular programming with updates. Radio broadcasts requested public assistance. Photographs of April appeared on television screens and in newspapers as investigators appealed for information from anyone who might have seen her during the day. The investigation soon extended beyond the immediate neighborhood. Officers examined roadways leading away from Fort Wayne, recognizing that child abduction cases often require rapid coordination across jurisdictions. Investigators notified neighboring law enforcement agencies and entered information concerning the missing child into available law enforcement communication systems. The community remained hopeful. Families gathered in churches to pray for April's safe return. Volunteers continued searching into the night despite deteriorating visibility. Parents kept their children indoors, and conversations throughout Fort Wayne centered upon one question: where was April Tinsley? The answer arrived the following day. On April 2nd, SIL 1988, a passerby discovered the body of a young girl in a ditch along a rural road in DeKalb County, approximately 20 miles northeast of Fort Wayne. Investigators quickly confirmed the devastating reality. The victim was 8-year-old April Tinsley. The discovery transformed a missing child investigation into a homicide investigation. The rural location immediately became an active crime scene. Detectives secured the area while crime scene technicians carefully documented every observable detail before evidence collection began. Photographs were taken from multiple angles. Measurements were recorded. Physical evidence was identified, marked, and preserved according to the forensic standards available in 1988. Investigators also recognized that the location where April's body was discovered might not represent the location where the crime had occurred. Determining whether the offender had transported her after the assault became one of the earliest investigative priorities. Every tire impression, footprint, trace material, and biological sample had the potential to identify whoever had committed the crime. The Allen County Coroner's Office conducted an autopsy to determine the cause and manner of death. According to the official investigation, April had been abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered. The findings confirmed that investigators were dealing with a deliberate act of extreme violence committed against a child. Details of the assault were carefully documented for investigative purposes, but law enforcement publicly withheld certain information to preserve evidence known only to the offender and investigators. That decision reflected a common investigative strategy in homicide cases. Specific details not released publicly can later help detectives evaluate confessions, witness statements, or information supplied by potential suspects. If an individual describes facts that were never made public, investigators can assess whether that knowledge could only have come from direct involvement in the crime. As crime scene investigators processed evidence, detectives began reconstructing April's final known movements. Witnesses were interviewed repeatedly. Neighborhood canvases expanded. Motorists who had traveled through the area were identified where possible. Known sex offenders living nearby were investigated. Individuals with histories of violent crime were questioned. Thousands of leads would eventually be generated during the investigation's earliest weeks. The murder shocked Indiana. Fort Wayne had experienced violent crime before, but the abduction and murder of an 8-year-old child during a holiday weekend profoundly affected the community. Parents altered daily routines almost immediately. Children who had once walked or ridden bicycles alone were now escorted by adults. Schools discussed safety procedures. Community meetings focused on protecting children from strangers. Law enforcement agencies likewise recognized the extraordinary importance of solving the case quickly. Investigators understood that offenders responsible for child abductions and sexually motivated homicides sometimes commit additional crimes if not identified. Every hour without an arrest increased both public anxiety and investigative pressure. Yet despite intensive investigative activity, no immediate suspect emerged. Evidence had been collected. Witnesses had been interviewed. Searches had been conducted. Tips continued arriving from members of the public. Still, investigators lacked the one element necessary to resolve the case: the identity of the person responsible. What they did not realize in the spring of 1988 was that among the evidence carefully preserved from the investigation was biological material that would remain scientifically valuable for decades. At the time, forensic DNA analysis was still in its infancy. Detectives could not know that the evidence they were preserving would eventually become the key to identifying the killer many years later. For the moment, however, those possibilities remained beyond the reach of contemporary science. The investigation entered its earliest and most difficult Phase A race against time, in which every lead mattered, every witness interview carried hope, and every unanswered question deepened the mystery surrounding the murder of 8-year-old April Tinsley. In the days following the discovery of April Tinsley's body, investigators from the Fort Wayne Police Department and the Indiana State Police confronted the difficult reality that they were dealing with a child abduction and homicide. With no identified suspect, no confirmed eyewitness to the abduction, and no clear explanation for how an 8-year-old girl had been taken from a neighborhood where children were accustomed to moving freely between friends' homes. The investigation expanded rapidly. Detectives established a command structure to coordinate interviews, evidence collection, and public communications. Officers conducted door-to-door canvasses throughout the neighborhood where April had last been seen. Residents were asked whether they had observed unfamiliar vehicles, suspicious individuals, unusual sounds, or any activity that stood out on the morning of April 1, 1988. Investigators also reviewed reports from motorists who had traveled along roads leading out of Fort Wayne and through rural DeKalb County, where the body had been discovered. One of the earliest priorities was reconstructing April's final known movements as precisely as possible. Witnesses confirmed that she had been alive during the morning hours and had been seen riding her bicycle in the neighborhood. Detectives attempted to determine the exact route she had taken, the home she had visited, and the approximate time when she disappeared from public view. Even small discrepancies in witness recollections were examined because a difference of only a few minutes could significantly affect the timeline. Crime scene technicians continued processing physical evidence recovered from the location where April's body had been found. Investigators searched the surrounding area for tire impressions, footwear impressions, discarded objects, fibers, and other trace evidence that might connect the offender to the scene. Because the body had been discovered in a roadside ditch in a rural area, detectives considered the possibility that the offender had transported April there after abducting her elsewhere. Determining whether the location was a primary crime scene or a disposal site became a central investigative question. The autopsy findings provided important forensic information. Medical examiners confirmed that April had been sexually assaulted and murdered. Biological evidence was collected and preserved for forensic examination. In 1988, however, DNA profiling was not yet a routine investigative tool available to most local law enforcement agencies. Investigators therefore relied heavily on serological testing, blood typing, and other forensic methods available at the time while preserving biological samples in the event that future scientific advances might allow additional analysis. This decision would later prove extraordinarily important. At the time, though, detectives could not know whether the preserved evidence would ever identify a suspect. As news of the murder spread across Indiana, public response intensified. Thousands of tips began arriving through police hotlines, local media appeals, and direct contact with investigators. Detectives worked around the clock, evaluating each lead. Reports ranged from sightings of suspicious vehicles and unfamiliar men in the neighborhood to claims involving known offenders, transients, and individuals whose behavior had alarmed friends or relatives after the murder became public. Investigators developed extensive lists of persons of interest. Known sex offenders living in Allen County were interviewed. Individuals with histories of crimes against children were examined. Men who owned vehicles matching descriptions provided by witnesses were identified. Alibis were checked. Employment records were reviewed. Search warrants were executed when investigators believed evidence might be present. The scale of the investigation quickly became enormous. Within weeks, detectives had conducted hundreds of interviews and collected large volumes of documentary evidence. Yet despite this intensive effort, no suspect could be conclusively linked to the crime. Then the case took an even more disturbing turn. On April 14, still 1988, less than 2 weeks after April's murder, a local resident discovered a handwritten note attached to a bicycle left outside a home in Fort Wayne. The note contained a chilling message indicating knowledge of the crime and appeared to have been written by the killer. For investigators, the letter represented the first direct communication potentially originating from the offender. The note was immediately treated as critical evidence. Crime scene technicians photographed it, collected it using procedures designed to preserve fingerprints and trace evidence, and submitted it for forensic examination. Handwriting experts were asked to analyze the writing style, letter formation, spelling patterns, and other characteristics that might help identify the author. Detectives also examined the paper, ink, and method of attachment to determine whether they could trace the materials to a particular source. The content of the note suggested that the writer possessed knowledge not publicly available, increasing investigators' belief that it had been authored by the person responsible for April's murder. Law enforcement officials withheld portions of the message from the public to preserve investigative details that could later be used to evaluate suspects or future communications. The letter changed the investigation in several ways. First, it indicated that the offender was willing to reinsert himself into the case after the murder. Second, it suggested a desire to frighten the community or gain attention from investigators and the media. Third, it raised concerns that the individual might commit additional offenses. Behavioral analysts were consulted to help investigators interpret the significance of the communication. While offender profiling could not identify a suspect by itself, analysts examined whether the letter revealed personality traits, educational background, emotional state, or patterns of behavior that might assist the investigation. The community's fear deepened considerably after the letter became known. Parents who had already become cautious after April's murder now faced the possibility that the killer remained in the area and was actively taunting investigators. Children were warned not to speak with strangers, not to ride bicycles alone, and not to walk unaccompanied even short distances through familiar neighborhoods. Despite the heightened public anxiety, detectives continued pursuing evidence methodically. Laboratories examined the letter for fingerprints and biological material. Investigators compared the handwriting against samples obtained from numerous individuals. Suspects were asked to provide writing exemplars. Searches were conducted for stationery or writing materials similar to those used in the note. Once again, however, the investigation produced no conclusive identification. The lack of immediate forensic success reflected the limitations of the era. Fingerprint recovery from paper is often difficult, and DNA analysis of touched objects was not yet feasible with the technology available in 1988. Detectives were forced to rely primarily on traditional investigative techniques, witness testimony, and the hope that someone would recognize the handwriting or come forward with incriminating information. As the weeks turned into months, investigators continued reviewing every aspect of the case. They mapped the locations where April had been seen, where her bicycle had been found, where the body had been discovered, and where the threatening note had appeared. Geographic analysis was used to determine whether the offender's actions suggested familiarity with particular neighborhoods, roadways, or rural areas of northeastern Indiana. The possibility that the killer lived or worked in the Fort Wayne area remained a major focus. Detectives reasoned that the offender had likely known enough about the community to abduct a child without attracting immediate attention and to select a rural disposal location that was isolated yet accessible by vehicle. They also considered whether the person might have been someone April had seen before, reducing the likelihood that she would have resisted initially. Investigators interviewed April's relatives, neighbors, teachers, and family acquaintances repeatedly, searching for any connection that might explain how the offender had gained access to her. No evidence emerged indicating that the family had known the killer. By the end of 1988, the investigation had generated thousands of leads, consumed enormous law enforcement resources, and produced one of the most extensive child homicide case files in Indiana history. Yet the central question remained unanswered. Who had taken April Tinsley from her neighborhood on the morning of April 1st, SIL 1988? The handwritten note remained the most haunting piece of evidence. It suggested that the killer was not simply hiding from investigators, but was watching the investigation unfold and taking satisfaction in the fear spreading through the community. Detectives preserved the letter carefully, recognizing that future forensic advances might reveal evidence that contemporary laboratories could not detect. That decision to preserve every possible trace of evidence, no matter how limited its immediate value appeared, would become one of the most consequential choices made during the investigation. Years later, when forensic DNA technology had advanced far beyond the capabilities of 1988, investigators would return to these preserved materials, searching for answers that had remained hidden since the spring morning when 8-year-old April Tinsley disappeared. As the investigation into the murder of April Tinsley continued through 1988, detectives faced not only the challenge of identifying an unknown offender, but also the unsettling realization that the individual responsible appeared willing to communicate with the public. Rather than disappearing after committing the crime, the offender seemed intent on reminding the community that he remained free. The handwritten note, discovered approximately 2 weeks after April's murder, immediately became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the investigation. Crime laboratory personnel examined the document using every forensic method available at the time. Detectives searched for latent fingerprints, analyzed the handwriting, studied the paper and ink, and looked for trace evidence that might identify its origin. The note was photographed, cataloged, and preserved under carefully documented chain of custody procedures. Although no immediate forensic identification resulted, investigators recognized that the letter might become increasingly valuable as laboratory technology improved. The content of the message disturbed investigators for 2 reasons. First, it strongly suggested that the author possessed knowledge of the crime that had not been publicly released. Second, its tone indicated an individual willing to reinsert himself into the investigation rather than avoid attention. Behavioral specialists consulted by investigators noted that some offenders seek psychological satisfaction by observing public reaction to their crimes or by attempting to influence investigations through anonymous communications. Such observations, however, could not identify a specific individual and were treated only as investigative considerations rather than evidence. Throughout the spring and summer of 1988, detectives continued following thousands of leads. Every reported suspicious vehicle was investigated. Every potential witness was interviewed. Known offenders living in northeastern Indiana were questioned. Handwriting samples were collected from numerous individuals whose names arose during the investigation. Search warrants were executed where investigators believed relevant evidence might exist. Despite these efforts, no suspect could be linked conclusively to either the homicide or the anonymous note. The absence of an arrest increased public concern. Parents throughout Fort Wayne changed daily routines almost immediately. Children who had once walked alone to friends' homes were now accompanied by adults. Bicycle rides became closely supervised. Schools discussed personal safety with students, and neighborhood organizations encouraged residents to report unfamiliar individuals or suspicious activity to law enforcement without delay. Local media continued extensive coverage of the investigation. Television stations regularly aired photographs of April Tinsley while encouraging viewers to submit information. Newspapers published updates concerning investigative progress and appeals for public assistance. Law enforcement officials emphasized that even seemingly insignificant observations might prove important when combined with other evidence. As the months passed, however, public leads gradually diminished. Investigators revisited earlier interviews, searching for inconsistencies or overlooked details. Witnesses were recontacted. Timelines were reconstructed repeatedly. The detectives compared information gathered from independent sources in an effort to identify patterns that might point toward a previously overlooked suspect. The investigation remained active, but progress became increasingly difficult. Then, approximately 3 years after the murder, the case took another disturbing turn. In 1990 and 1991, additional anonymous communications appeared in Fort Wayne. This time, the messages were found on barns and other structures near the locations where children waited for school buses. The messages referred directly to April Tinsley and contained explicit threats toward other children. Investigators immediately recognized the significance of these writings. Unlike rumors or unverified reports received through anonymous telephone calls, the messages constituted physical evidence that could be documented and examined. Officers secured each location before collecting forensic evidence. Crime scene photographers documented the writings exactly as they appeared before investigators removed or preserved the relevant materials. The threatening messages intensified fear throughout the community. Parents became increasingly concerned that the person responsible for April's murder remained in the area years after the crime and continued demonstrating an interest in frightening local families. School officials coordinated closely with law enforcement regarding student safety. Bus stop procedures were reviewed. Patrol officers increased their visibility near schools and neighborhoods where children gathered. The investigation expanded once again. Detectives examined whether the same individual had authored both the original handwritten note and the later public messages. Handwriting specialists compared letter formations, spelling, punctuation, and writing characteristics. Investigators evaluated vocabulary choices and phrasing in an effort to determine whether common authorship could be established. Although similarities were noted, the available forensic methods could not conclusively identify the writer. The messages nevertheless provided investigators with additional insight into offender behavior. Behavioral analysts observed that the communication suggested an individual seeking continued psychological influence over the community long after the homicide. Such conduct has been documented in certain criminal investigations involving offenders who derive satisfaction from public attention or fear generated by their crimes. However, investigators remained careful not to overstate the value of behavioral analysis. Psychological observations could assist investigative planning, but could not establish identity or serve as courtroom evidence. The physical evidence remained the most important component of the investigation. Accordingly, investigators preserved every available item associated with the anonymous communications. Paper samples, photographs, measurements, writing comparisons, possible trace materials. Everything was retained according to evidence preservation standards. That decision reflected another important investigative principle. Evidence that cannot be fully examined today may become scientifically valuable tomorrow. During the early 1990s, forensic DNA technology continued developing but remained limited compared with later decades. Many forms of biological evidence could not yet be analyzed with sufficient sensitivity to identify unknown individuals. Consequently, detectives recognized that preserving evidence might ultimately prove more important than attempting exhaustive laboratory analysis using contemporary techniques. The April Tinsley investigation became increasingly recognized as one of Indiana's most significant unsolved child homicide cases. State and local agencies continued cooperating closely. Case files expanded into thousands of pages. Evidence inventories grew steadily. Investigators carefully documented every lead, regardless of whether it immediately produced results. The volume of information eventually became enormous. Thousands of interviews, numerous forensic examinations, hundreds of persons evaluated, extensive geographic analysis, behavioral assessments, vehicle information, employment records, criminal histories, public tips. Every piece of information was cataloged because detectives understood that future developments might give new significance to details that currently appeared unrelated. One important aspect of the investigation remained consistent throughout these years. Law enforcement officials deliberately withheld certain details from public disclosure. This practice served multiple investigative purposes. If an individual later confessed, detectives could evaluate whether that person possessed knowledge unavailable to the general public. Similarly, future anonymous communications could be assessed based upon whether the writer demonstrated familiarity with undisclosed investigative facts. Protecting sensitive information, therefore, strengthened the integrity of the investigation over the long term. As the early 1990s progressed, public attention gradually declined. New crimes occupied newspaper headlines. Personnel within law enforcement agencies changed. Some detectives retired while others assumed responsibility for the investigation. Yet the case itself never closed. Evidence remained preserved. Investigative reports remained organized. Property records, interview summaries, laboratory findings, and crime scene documentation continued to be maintained with exceptional care. This continuity would later become one of the investigation's greatest strengths. Years later, detectives assigned to the cold case would inherit not merely boxes of old reports, but a comprehensive investigative record documenting every significant decision made since April 1988. At the time, however, none of those future developments could be anticipated. The anonymous messages had intensified public fear. The offender remained unidentified. The investigation had generated thousands of leads without identifying a viable suspect. And despite relentless efforts by investigators, one troubling possibility became increasingly difficult to ignore. The person responsible for abducting, assaulting, and murdering April Tinsley might still be living an ordinary life somewhere within the same region, carrying a secret that no available forensic technology could yet expose. The case entered the decade of the 1990s with unanswered questions, preserved evidence, and a growing determination among investigators that even if immediate answers proved impossible, every document, every biological sample, and every piece of physical evidence would be protected for the day when science might finally catch up with the crime. By the early 1990s, the investigation into the murder of April Tinsley had entered a phase familiar to many major homicide investigations, but no less frustrating for the detectives involved. The initial surge of public tips had slowed, the most obvious investigative leads had been exhausted, and the unknown offender remained unidentified. Yet, unlike many cases that gradually disappeared into storage, April's murder continued to receive periodic attention from law enforcement because of its extraordinary seriousness, the anonymous messages believed to be connected to the offender, and the belief that critical evidence had been preserved for future analysis. The investigation officially became a cold case, but that designation did not mean investigators had abandoned it. Within law enforcement, a cold case refers to an investigation in which all immediately available leads have been pursued without identifying a suspect. Detectives continue reviewing evidence, evaluating new information, and reassessing the case whenever technological advances or investigative developments create fresh opportunities. April Tinsley's murder became exactly that type of investigation. The case files continued to grow. Every new tip received from the public was documented. Every name submitted to investigators was recorded. Background investigations were completed when appropriate. Fingerprints, handwriting samples, employment histories, vehicle registrations, and criminal records were compared whenever detectives believed they might be relevant. Although most leads ultimately proved unrelated to the crime, investigators understood that eliminating possibilities was as important as discovering new ones. Evidence preservation remained a central priority. Physical evidence recovered in 1988 was retained under controlled conditions according to established forensic protocols. Biological samples collected during the investigation were carefully cataloged and stored. Even though available laboratory technology could not yet extract all the information investigators hoped to obtain, detectives consistently recognized that scientific methods evolve, and evidence that appears limited during one era may become decisive during another. Throughout the 1990s, forensic DNA analysis advanced significantly. Short tandem repeat, or stranger analysis, gradually became the standard method for forensic DNA profiling in the United States. These improvements allowed laboratories to develop more reliable genetic profiles from increasingly small biological samples. As state and national DNA databases expanded, investigators submitted evidence from unsolved cases whenever suitable DNA profiles could be generated. The April Tinsley investigation benefited from these developments. Laboratory scientists re-examined preserved biological evidence using improved testing methods as technology became available. The goal was to generate a DNA profile suitable for comparison against offenders whose DNA had been entered into criminal databases. Eventually, investigators succeeded in developing a male DNA profile associated with the offender. This represented a major scientific achievement. For the first time, detectives possessed a genetic profile belonging to the individual responsible for the crime. Yet the breakthrough also revealed a new obstacle. Repeated searches of available law enforcement DNA databases produced no match. The unknown offender had apparently never submitted DNA that could be compared through existing criminal justice systems. The result was both encouraging and frustrating. Investigators knew they had preserved the killer's biological evidence. They knew the profile was scientifically reliable, but they still did not know whose DNA it was. Over the following years, detectives routinely requested updated comparisons as DNA databases continued expanding. Every time new offender profiles were added to state or national systems, the possibility existed that the unknown profile from April's case might finally produce a match. Again and again, those comparisons returned negative. The offender remained unidentified. Meanwhile, the case continued, affecting the Fort Wayne community. Each anniversary of April's disappearance prompted renewed media coverage and public appeals for information. Local newspapers revisited the investigation. Television stations interviewed detectives assigned to the cold case. Family members continued expressing hope that someone might eventually come forward with information capable of solving the murder. Investigators likewise refused to consider the case closed. Cold case detectives periodically reviewed the complete investigative record from the beginning. Original witness interviews were reread. Evidence inventories were verified. Crime scene photographs were re-examined. Anonymous letters and threatening messages were reconsidered. Detectives looked for overlooked inconsistencies, previously unidentified connections, or investigative opportunities created by advancing forensic science. This periodic review reflected an important principle of homicide investigation. Fresh investigators often noticed details that earlier detectives could not appreciate because they possessed different experience, access to improved technology, or the benefit of reviewing decades of accumulated information. Accordingly, assigning new investigators to long unsolved cases frequently provides valuable independent perspectives without discarding earlier investigative work. The April Tinsley investigation also became increasingly recognized within Indiana law enforcement as a model for comprehensive evidence management. Despite the passage of years, chain of custody documentation remained complete. Laboratory reports were preserved. Crime scene evidence remained available for additional testing. Interview summaries were organized systematically. This level of documentation ensured that future investigators could understand every significant step taken since 1988. Another development gradually changed the investigative landscape. During the late 1990s and early 2000s, digital record systems became increasingly common within law enforcement agencies. Historical investigative files that had originally existed only on paper began to be indexed, organized, and made more accessible for review. Although the original evidence itself remained physical, improved record management allowed detectives to search historical information more efficiently and compare investigative details across multiple decades. The growth of computerized criminal databases likewise improved investigators' ability to evaluate potential suspects. Employment histories, vehicle registrations, address records, criminal convictions, sex offender information. Many categories of information became easier to analyze than had been possible during the original investigation. Despite these improvements, however, the essential problem remained unchanged. Investigators possessed reliable forensic evidence, but lacked the identity of the individual from whom it originated. The anonymous communications associated with the investigation continued to attract attention. Handwriting comparisons remained inconclusive. Behavioral assessments were periodically reviewed. Detectives examined whether similar communications had appeared in other jurisdictions or whether offenders convicted elsewhere displayed comparable patterns. No definitive connection emerged. As years became decades, scientific progress continued accelerating. DNA sequencing methods improved. Laboratory sensitivity increased dramatically. Scientists developed techniques capable of analyzing increasingly small quantities of biological material. Each advancement prompted investigators to ask the same question: could today's technology reveal information that yesterday's technology could not? The answer often proved yes. Evidence previously considered unsuitable for analysis became testable. DNA profiles became more complete. Statistical interpretation became increasingly sophisticated. Yet even these improvements failed to identify the offender through conventional law enforcement databases. By the early 2010s, the murder of April Tinsley had remained unsolved for more than 25 years. A generation of children had grown into adulthood. Many residents of Fort Wayne had not even been born when the crime occurred. Nevertheless, detectives continued maintaining the investigation with the expectation that future scientific developments might eventually provide the breakthrough they had pursued for decades. That expectation would soon prove justified. Outside traditional law enforcement laboratories, researchers and forensic specialists were developing an entirely new investigative approach. Instead of searching only for exact DNA matches within criminal databases, scientists began exploring whether genetic relationships among distant relatives could help identify unknown individuals. Initially, the concept appeared more closely associated with genealogy than criminal investigation. Few detectives could have predicted that this emerging methodology would soon transform cold case investigations across the United States. For the investigators responsible for April Tinsley's case, the preserved DNA profile remained exactly as it had for years: complete, reliable, but anonymous. The science capable of turning that anonymous profile into the name of a suspect had not yet entered routine criminal investigation. When it finally did, one of Indiana's oldest and most heartbreaking cold cases would become one of the defining examples of how decades of careful evidence preservation, combined with a revolutionary forensic technique, could finally reveal the identity of a killer who had believed time alone would protect him forever. By the beginning of the 2010s, the investigation into the murder of April Tinsley had remained open for more than 2 decades. The detectives had exhausted traditional investigative methods, interviewed thousands of individuals, followed countless public tips, and repeatedly reviewed the evidence preserved since 1988. Although the case had never been forgotten within law enforcement, it remained defined by one frustrating reality: investigators possessed the offender's DNA profile but had no way of attaching that profile to a name. This situation was not unique. Across the United States, forensic laboratories held DNA profiles recovered from hundreds of unsolved homicides and sexual assaults. Many of those profiles had been entered into the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, the National Law Enforcement DNA database administered by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. CODIS had become one of the most successful forensic tools in modern criminal investigation, allowing laboratories to compare DNA recovered from crime scenes with DNA profiles obtained from convicted offenders and, depending on state law and the period involved, certain arrestees. The system had solved thousands of violent crimes. However, it also had a fundamental limitation. CODIS could only identify someone whose DNA was already present in the database. If an offender had never been required to submit a DNA sample, the comparison would return no match, regardless of how complete or accurate the crime scene profile might be. That was precisely the challenge facing investigators in the April Tinsley case. The DNA recovered from evidence associated with the homicide had been analyzed using increasingly sophisticated laboratory techniques. Scientists had confidence in the profile's reliability. Yet every comparison against available law enforcement databases ended with the same result: no match, no suspect, no identity. As conventional forensic options reached their limits, another field of science was advancing outside traditional criminal investigation. During the early 21st century, commercial genetic testing became increasingly popular. Millions of individuals voluntarily submitted saliva samples to private companies to learn about family history, ancestral origins, and distant biological relatives. These services were designed for genealogy rather than criminal investigation, but they demonstrated an important scientific principle. People who share common ancestors also share measurable portions of inherited DNA. Professional genealogists had long reconstructed family histories using birth records, marriage certificates, census documents, obituaries, military records, cemetery information, and numerous other historical sources. Genetic testing added a new layer of information by identifying biological relationships that documentary records alone could not always reveal. Eventually, forensic scientists recognized that these same principles might assist criminal investigations. If investigators could not identify the offender directly, perhaps they could identify distant relatives whose voluntarily submitted genetic information revealed the offender's extended family tree. This concept became known as investigative genetic genealogy. Unlike conventional forensic DNA comparison, investigative genetic genealogy does not seek an exact match between two DNA profiles. Instead, it searches for partial genetic relationships that may indicate shared ancestry. Even relatively distant cousins can share enough inherited DNA to help genealogists reconstruct large family networks spanning multiple generations. The process is exceptionally labor-intensive. A single genetic match rarely identifies a suspect. Instead, genealogists examine historical records to build extensive family trees, tracing descendants forward through time while eliminating individuals who could not have committed the crime because of age, location, or other documented facts. Only after narrowing hundreds or thousands of relatives to a manageable number do investigators begin evaluating potential suspects using traditional police methods. The first major public demonstration of this methodology occurred in 2018 with the identification of the man accused of being the Golden State Killer. That investigation attracted worldwide attention because it showed that investigative genetic genealogy could succeed where decades of conventional investigation had failed. Law enforcement agencies across the United States immediately began evaluating whether similar methods might assist other unsolved violent crimes. Among the cases considered was the murder of April Tinsley. Investigators in Indiana recognized that the case possessed several characteristics necessary for genealogical analysis. First, biological evidence had been carefully preserved since 1988. Second, forensic laboratories had already developed a reliable DNA profile associated with the offender. Third, repeated searches through CODIS had failed to identify the unknown individual. These conditions made the investigation a strong candidate for the emerging methodology. The Indiana State Police began collaborating with specialists capable of performing advanced genetic analysis suitable for genealogical research. Importantly, the DNA profile used for investigative genealogy differed from the shorter forensic profile routinely generated for CODIS. Genealogical analysis required substantially more genetic information in order to identify distant biological relationships. Accordingly, laboratory scientists performed additional testing on the preserved biological evidence to generate data appropriate for genealogical comparison. This step represented a remarkable scientific progression. The biological material collected by investigators in 1988 was now being examined using technologies that had not existed when the evidence was first preserved. Without the careful collection and storage decisions made 3 decades earlier, this analysis would not have been possible. Once the expanded genetic profile had been produced, investigators pursued genealogical analysis through databases that, under their policies at the time, permitted law enforcement use for qualifying violent crime investigations. The results did not identify the offender directly. Instead, they identified individuals who appeared to be distant biological relatives. For experienced genealogists, that information provided the starting point rather than the conclusion. The next stage required extensive historical research. Genealogists examined public records from multiple states: birth certificates, marriage records, death certificates, census information, military records, newspaper archives, obituaries, property records. Each document helped establish biological relationships extending across several generations. As family trees expanded, the number of potential descendants grew into the hundreds. Most could be eliminated quickly. Some were too young. Others had died before 1988. Many had lived in distant states with no apparent connection to northeastern Indiana. Investigators gradually narrowed the list by applying known facts from the homicide investigation. The offender was believed to be an adult male living in or familiar with the Fort Wayne area in 1988. He would have been physically capable of committing the abduction, sexual assault, and murder. He would likely have had access to transportation. Every documented fact helped reduce the number of possible candidates. Detectives worked closely with genealogists throughout the process. The genealogical research generated investigative hypotheses, but police investigators remained responsible for evaluating each potential suspect through conventional methods. Employment histories were reviewed. Residential addresses were examined. Criminal records were checked. Connections to Fort Wayne were investigated. Potential opportunities to obtain confirmatory DNA samples were considered. This careful separation between genealogy and criminal investigation reflected an important legal principle. Genealogical analysis generated investigative leads. It did not establish guilt. Any person identified through genealogy still had to be independently investigated using traditional police work and admissible forensic evidence. As investigators continued narrowing the family tree, one individual increasingly attracted attention. His documented history appeared consistent with several facts already known about the case. He had lived in the Fort Wayne area during the relevant period. His age fit the expected offender profile. Most importantly, genealogical analysis indicated that he could plausibly be the source of the unknown DNA recovered in 1988. That individual was John D. Miller. Despite becoming a significant investigative focus, Miller was not immediately arrested. Detectives understood that genealogy alone could not support criminal charges. But before confronting him, they needed the same type of direct forensic confirmation that had been unavailable throughout the previous 30 years. Accordingly, investigators began planning the next phase of the operation. The objective was straightforward: obtain a lawfully recoverable DNA sample from Miller without alerting him that he had become the focus of one of Indiana's longest-running cold case investigations. Only if that DNA matched the biological evidence preserved since 1988 would investigators possess the scientific confirmation necessary to proceed. After 3 decades of unanswered questions, the investigation had finally reached its most promising point since April Tinsley's murder. Yet the decisive moment still lay ahead. The success of the entire genealogical investigation and the possibility of finally identifying the person responsible now depended on whether the DNA recovered from a seemingly ordinary discarded object would match the anonymous genetic profile that detectives had protected for 30 years. By the summer of 2018, investigators working on the April Tinsley homicide had reached a stage that detectives on the case had imagined for decades but had never believed would be possible. After extensive investigative genetic genealogy research, the list of potential suspects had been narrowed dramatically. Years of scientific advancement and meticulous genealogical reconstruction had transformed an anonymous DNA profile into a focused investigative lead. That lead was John D. Miller. Even so, experienced investigators understood that genealogy alone was not sufficient to support an arrest. Investigative genetic genealogy is designed to generate leads, not prove criminal responsibility. Before prosecutors could consider filing charges, detectives needed independent forensic evidence directly connecting Miller to the biological material recovered during the original investigation. The next phase therefore relied not on advanced genetics, but on traditional police work. Investigators began discreet surveillance. Detectives monitored Miller's daily routines without alerting him that he had become the focus of one of Indiana's most significant cold case investigations. Surveillance teams observed his movements, documented his activities, and searched for an opportunity to lawfully recover an item that he had discarded in public. This technique has long been used in criminal investigations. Under established legal principles in the United States, individuals generally have a reduced expectation of privacy in property they voluntarily abandon in public places. Consequently, law enforcement officers may recover discarded items, provided the collection complies with applicable legal standards. Such items frequently contain biological material, including saliva, that can be analyzed for DNA. For investigators, this represented the critical test. If the DNA obtained from Miller matched the offender's DNA preserved since 1988, decades of investigative effort would converge into a single scientific conclusion. The surveillance operation required patience. Detectives avoided direct contact. They maintained careful documentation of their observations. Every action was recorded because investigators anticipated that every aspect of the operation might later be examined during court proceedings. Eventually, the opportunity arrived. According to investigators, Miller discarded an item containing biological material. Detectives recovered the item and submitted it to the Indiana State Police Laboratory for forensic DNA analysis. The laboratory comparison followed established forensic procedures. Scientists extracted DNA from the recovered material. Quality control measures ensured the reliability of the analysis. The resulting DNA profile was then compared with the male DNA profile that investigators had preserved from evidence collected during the April 1988 homicide investigation. The result was decisive. According to law enforcement and later court proceedings, the DNA profiles matched. For investigators, this represented the moment the entire investigation changed. For more than 30 years, detectives had known the killer's genetic profile, but not his identity. Now, for the first time, the unknown DNA belonged to a specific individual. The identification did not rest upon witness memory. It did not depend upon speculation or anonymous accusations. It was based upon biological evidence collected in 1988 and independently confirmed through modern forensic analysis in 2018. Even after receiving the laboratory results, investigators proceeded cautiously. Major homicide investigations require more than a single piece of evidence before an arrest is made. Detectives reviewed the complete investigative record once again, ensuring that all available information was consistent with the new forensic findings. Historical records showed that Miller had lived in the Fort Wayne area at the time of April's murder. His age was consistent with the offender profile investigators had considered for decades. The genealogical research, surveillance operation, and forensic DNA comparison all pointed toward the same individual. Only after completing this comprehensive review did investigators prepare for the arrest. On July 15, 2018, officers arrested John D. Miller at his residence in Greville, Indiana, a small community northeast of Fort Wayne. The announcement immediately became national news. For 30 years, the murder of April Tinsley had remained one of Indiana's most notorious unsolved child homicide cases. Now investigators were publicly identifying a suspect. Law enforcement agencies held a press conference explaining that advances in DNA technology and investigative genetic genealogy had played a central role in identifying Miller. Officials emphasized that careful evidence preservation dating back to 1988 had made the scientific breakthrough possible. The arrest generated widespread public attention because it occurred only a few months after the Golden State Killer investigation had demonstrated the effectiveness of investigative genetic genealogy. Together, the two cases illustrated the rapidly expanding role of genetic genealogy in solving violent crimes that had remained unresolved for decades. Following the arrest, investigators executed search warrants at Miller's residence. The searches sought evidence that might further support the homicide investigation. As with all major criminal investigations, detectives carefully documented the collection of physical evidence and maintained chain of custody records for every item recovered. Authorities were also interested in determining whether Miller might be connected to any additional unsolved crimes. Investigators reviewed historical case information and compared available evidence with other unresolved investigations where appropriate. Such reviews are standard practice following the identification of suspects in serious violent crimes, particularly when the offender has remained unidentified for many years. The next significant phase involved interviewing Miller. According to court records and public reporting, investigators questioned him regarding the April Tinsley homicide. The interview formed part of the broader investigative process that followed the DNA identification. As with any criminal investigation, statements made during interviews were evaluated alongside the physical evidence rather than viewed in isolation. Throughout the investigation, detectives remained careful to distinguish between investigative methods and admissible evidence. Investigative genetic genealogy had identified a promising lead. Surveillance produced an independent DNA sample. Laboratory analysis confirmed the DNA match. Traditional investigative procedures verified the suspect's connection to the geographic area. Each step strengthened the evidentiary foundation supporting criminal prosecution. For forensic scientists, the case represented a remarkable validation of decades of technological progress. The biological evidence collected in 1988 had survived intact because crime scene investigators understood the importance of preserving every available sample, even though contemporary science could not fully analyze it. 30 years later, that same evidence became the foundation for one of the most significant cold case breakthroughs in Indiana history. For detectives who had worked the investigation across multiple generations, the arrest marked the culmination of extraordinary persistence. Many of the original investigators had retired long before the case was solved. Others had passed away. New detectives inherited the files, reviewed the evidence repeatedly, and continued searching for opportunities created by scientific advancement. The arrest demonstrated that successful cold case investigations often depend upon institutional continuity rather than the work of a single investigator. The announcement also carried profound significance for April Tinsley's family. After 3 decades of unanswered questions, law enforcement officials could finally explain that scientific evidence had identified the individual believed responsible for her murder. Although no arrest could undo the loss suffered in 1988, the investigation had moved beyond uncertainty and into the judicial process. Yet investigators recognized that an arrest was not the conclusion. The criminal justice system still required prosecutors to present the evidence in court. Defense counsel would examine every stage of the investigation. Forensic experts would explain the DNA analysis. Investigative genetic genealogy would receive careful scrutiny because of its relatively recent introduction into criminal investigations. Ultimately, the evidence would be evaluated according to established legal standards by the court. The decades-long search for a suspect had finally reached its destination. The equally important task of proving the case through admissible evidence was about to begin. The arrest of John D. Miller on July 15, SIL 2018, marked the end of one phase of the April Tinsley investigation, but it immediately began another. For investigators, identifying a suspect through DNA was an extraordinary achievement. For prosecutors, however, the challenge was different. Every scientific finding, every investigative decision, and every piece of preserved evidence would now have to withstand examination in court. Following Miller's arrest, the Indiana State Police, the Fort Wayne Police Department, prosecutors from Allen County, and forensic specialists worked together to organize a case that stretched back more than 30 years. The volume of evidence was substantial. Investigators assembled original crime scene reports from April 1988. Autopsy findings were reviewed. Laboratory reports generated over several decades were collected. Chain of custody documentation for biological evidence was carefully examined. Detectives also reviewed thousands of pages of witness interviews, investigative memoranda, and reports documenting every significant step taken during the investigation. Because the homicide had occurred in 1988, prosecutors anticipated that the defense would closely examine the preservation of evidence over 3 decades. For that reason, documenting continuity became especially important. Every transfer of evidence between investigators and laboratories had been recorded. Storage conditions had been documented. Laboratory procedures followed accepted forensic standards. The prosecution intended to demonstrate that the biological evidence analyzed in 2018 was the same evidence collected during the original investigation. This continuity was essential to maintaining the integrity of the forensic conclusions. Following the arrest, investigators also obtained a court-authorized DNA sample directly from Miller. This additional sample provided another opportunity for laboratory comparison using standard forensic methods. Scientists again compared Miller's DNA profile with the biological evidence recovered during the homicide investigation. The results remained consistent with the earlier comparison made using discarded biological material. The independent confirmation strengthened the evidentiary foundation of the prosecution. The DNA evidence itself became one component of a broader investigative record. Prosecutors did not rely exclusively upon forensic science. Instead, they prepared to present a comprehensive chronology explaining how investigators had preserved evidence, repeatedly reviewed the case, adopted emerging forensic technologies, employed investigative genetic genealogy as a lead-generating tool, and finally confirmed Miller's identity through conventional DNA analysis. This distinction was important. Investigative genetic genealogy had not been intended as courtroom evidence establishing guilt. Rather, it explained how investigators identified a possible suspect after decades without investigative leads. The evidence ultimately presented in court centered on conventional forensic DNA comparisons performed according to accepted laboratory procedures. As preparations continued, prosecutors formally charged Miller with murder, criminal deviant conduct, and confinement under Indiana law as it existed when the offense occurred in 1988. Because criminal statutes applicable at the time of the offense governed prosecution, the charges reflected the legal framework in effect during that period rather than later revisions to Indiana criminal law. And court proceedings attracted substantial public attention. The murder of April Tinsley had remained one of Indiana's best-known unsolved child homicide cases for more than 30 years. Many members of the public had followed developments since the original investigation. Others became familiar with the case only after the announcement that advances in DNA science had identified a suspect. Media organizations reported extensively on the role of forensic genealogy, while carefully distinguishing between genealogy itself and the traditional DNA evidence expected to be presented during trial. As per-trial proceedings progressed, attorneys addressed a variety of legal issues common in complex homicide prosecutions: evidence preservation, scientific methodology, discovery, expert testimony, procedural scheduling. Because the investigation involved relatively new forensic techniques alongside conventional DNA analysis, both prosecution and defense prepared extensively for the presentation of scientific evidence. Throughout this period, investigators continued examining whether Miller could be connected to any additional unsolved crimes. Reviewing other cases following the identification of a suspect in a serious violent offense is standard investigative practice. Authorities compared available information where appropriate, although each investigation required independent evidence before any conclusions could be reached. No additional homicide charges resulted from those reviews. Meanwhile, forensic experts prepared to explain DNA analysis in language understandable to jurors. One of the continuing challenges in modern criminal trials involves translating highly technical scientific concepts into clear, accurate testimony. Laboratory scientists anticipated explaining how DNA profiles are generated, how quality control procedures ensure reliability, how comparisons are performed, and why the biological evidence recovered in 1988 remains suitable for modern analysis. The preservation of evidence became one of the strongest features of the investigation. Crime scene personnel working in 1988 had collected biological material according to accepted forensic procedures, despite the fact that the full potential of DNA analysis was not yet understood. Successive generations of investigators maintained that evidence carefully for 3 decades. Laboratories documented every examination. Property custodians maintained chain of custody records. Without this continuous attention to evidence management, later scientific advances would have been impossible to apply. As the case approached trial, another significant development occurred. In December 2019, before a jury trial began, John B. Miller entered a guilty plea. By pleading guilty, Miller accepted responsibility for the crimes charged, eliminating the need for a lengthy presentation of evidence before a jury. According to court proceedings, the guilty plea spared April Tinsley's family from reliving every detail of the investigation during a full trial. The plea also brought formal judicial acknowledgement of responsibility after more than 30 years of uncertainty. During the plea hearing, the court reviewed the factual basis supporting the charges. The proceedings reflected established criminal procedure, requiring the court to determine that the plea was entered knowingly, voluntarily, and supported by sufficient evidence. Following acceptance of the plea, the case proceeded to sentencing. In 2020, the court sentenced Miller to 80 years in prison. The sentence reflected the seriousness of the crimes and the applicable provisions of Indiana law governing offenses committed in 1988. For April's family, the sentencing concluded the criminal prosecution, although the consequences of the crime had endured for more than 3 decades. For investigators, the guilty plea represented the successful conclusion of one of the longest-running homicide investigations in Indiana history. Unlike many cold cases resolved through circumstantial evidence alone, the April Tinsley investigation rested upon preserved biological evidence that had been repeatedly examined as forensic science evolved. The case demonstrated that careful evidence preservation can allow scientific advances developed decades later to answer questions that investigators could not resolve using the technology available at the time of the crime. Law enforcement officials also emphasized another important lesson. The investigation succeeded because no single breakthrough solved the case independently. Original crime scene investigators preserved evidence. Laboratory scientists developed increasingly sophisticated DNA techniques. Detectives maintained the investigation over 3 decades. Genealogists reconstructed extended family relationships. Surveillance officers obtained an independent DNA sample. Prosecutors organized decades of investigative work into a legally admissible case. Each discipline contributed an essential element. The guilty plea, therefore, represented not only the conclusion of a criminal prosecution, but also the culmination of sustained cooperation across generations of investigators and scientists. By the beginning of 2020, the legal questions surrounding responsibility for April Tinsley's murder had been resolved through the judicial process. The broader significance of the investigation, however, was only beginning to be understood. Across the United States and internationally, law enforcement agencies studied the case as an example of how investigative genetic genealogy, when combined with traditional detective work and rigorous forensic standards, could transform the investigation of violent crimes that had remained unsolved for decades. The legacy of the case would soon extend far beyond Indiana, influencing the future direction of cold case investigations and reshaping expectations about what modern forensic science could achieve. The resolution of the April Tinsley investigation is frequently discussed alongside the history of investigative genetic genealogy because it demonstrated how an emerging scientific methodology could be integrated into a traditional homicide investigation while remaining consistent with established forensic and legal standards. Although public attention often focused on the phrase genetic genealogy, the investigation itself was considerably more complex. The successful identification of John D. Miller resulted from the careful combination of preserved evidence, advanced laboratory science, genealogical research, conventional police investigation, and judicial oversight. To understand why the case represented such an important development, it is necessary to distinguish investigative genetic genealogy from traditional forensic DNA analysis. Conventional forensic DNA profiling, the method used in criminal laboratories for decades, is designed to determine whether DNA samples originate from the same individual. Laboratories analyze specific genetic markers and compare the resulting profiles. If the profiles match according to accepted statistical standards, investigators can conclude that the biological material originated from the same person or, in rare circumstances, an identical twin. This method is extraordinarily reliable when a comparison sample already exists. Its limitation is straightforward. Investigators must already possess DNA from the person they are attempting to identify. If that individual's DNA has never entered a law enforcement database, traditional comparison produces no identification. That was exactly the situation confronting investigators in the April Tinsley homicide. For years, detectives possessed a complete forensic DNA profile developed from biological evidence associated with the crime. The profile was entered into CODIS, where it was compared repeatedly against DNA submitted by convicted offenders and others included under applicable state and federal laws. Every search produced the same outcome: no match. The absence of a match did not weaken the forensic evidence. Instead, it indicated only that the offender's DNA was not present within the database. Investigative genetic genealogy approached the problem from an entirely different perspective. Rather than searching for an identical DNA profile, genealogists searched for individuals who shared portions of inherited DNA because of common ancestry. Even distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, or more distant family members may share measurable segments of DNA inherited from shared ancestors many generations earlier. This concept transformed the investigation. Instead of asking, "Whose DNA is this?" investigators began asking, "Who might be biologically related to the person who left this DNA?" Answering that question required substantially more genetic information than conventional forensic profiling. Laboratory scientists therefore generated a different type of DNA data suitable for genealogical comparison. This expanded genetic profile contained hundreds of thousands of genetic markers rather than the relatively small number used in standard forensic identification. The resulting data could then be compared with profiles voluntarily submitted to genealogy databases that permitted law enforcement access under their policies at the time. When the comparison was completed, investigators did not receive the name of a suspect. Instead, they received information identifying people who appeared to be distant biological relatives of the unknown offender. This marked only the beginning of the genealogical investigation. Professional genealogists then undertook an extensive historical research project. Using public records, they reconstructed family histories extending back multiple generations. Birth certificates identified parent-child relationships. Marriage records connected family branches. Death certificates confirmed family structures. Census records documented households. Obituaries identified descendants. Military records, newspaper archives, cemetery records, property documents, and other historical sources filled additional gaps. Gradually, separate family lines converged. Each newly documented relationship narrowed the range of possible descendants. As the family tree expanded, genealogists began moving forward through time. They identified children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, successive generations. Eventually, hundreds of living descendants became potential candidates. Most could be eliminated almost immediately. Some were women. Others were too young. Many had never lived anywhere near northeastern Indiana. Some had died before April's murder in 1988. Each documented fact allowed investigators to reduce the list further. Genealogy alone could not identify the offender. Traditional police investigation became essential. Detectives reviewed addresses, employment histories, driver's license information, property ownership, criminal records, known associates, geographic connections. Every available record was examined to determine which individuals fit the known circumstances of the homicide. Among the remaining candidates, one person increasingly matched the investigative profile: John D. Miller. Genealogical analysis suggested that Miller could plausibly be the source of the unknown DNA. Historical records confirmed that he had lived in the Fort Wayne area during the relevant period. His age corresponded with investigators' expectations concerning the offender. The investigation therefore shifted from genealogical research back to conventional police work. Surveillance teams observed Miller discreetly. Investigators waited for an opportunity to recover biological material that he discarded voluntarily in a public place. Once that opportunity arose, detectives collected the item and submitted it for standard forensic DNA comparison. This final laboratory analysis followed the same scientific procedures routinely used in criminal investigations across the United States. No genealogy was involved at this stage. Scientists compared the DNA obtained from Miller with the DNA profile preserved from evidence collected during the April Tinsley investigation. The profiles matched. At that moment, the genealogical investigation had fulfilled its purpose. It had generated a lead. Traditional forensic science confirmed the lead. The criminal investigation proceeded using established evidentiary standards. This distinction became particularly important during public discussions of the case. Some observers mistakenly concluded that people were being convicted based solely upon genealogy. That was not what occurred. Investigative genetic genealogy served as an investigative tool, much like fingerprint comparisons, anonymous tips, or witness information. The evidence supporting prosecution consisted of conventional forensic DNA analysis, preserved biological evidence, investigative documentation, and additional corroborating facts developed during the investigation. The April Tinsley investigation, therefore, became a model for explaining the appropriate role of investigative genetic genealogy. Professional organizations, forensic laboratories, and law enforcement agencies frequently emphasized several principles illustrated by the case. Genealogy generates investigative leads. Traditional investigation verifies those leads. Forensic DNA provides admissible scientific evidence. The judicial process evaluates that evidence according to established legal standards. Each stage performs a separate function. The investigation also demonstrated the extraordinary value of evidence preservation. Crime scene investigators in 1988 could not have anticipated the development of investigative genetic genealogy. Nevertheless, they preserved biological evidence according to accepted forensic procedures. That evidence remained scientifically usable more than 30 years later because every generation of investigators recognized its potential future importance. Without that preservation, no amount of technological advancement could have solved the case. Another lesson concerned interdisciplinary cooperation. The investigation required expertise from numerous professional fields: crime scene specialists, forensic biologists, DNA analysts, professional genealogists, cold case detectives, surveillance officers, prosecutors. Each discipline contributed specialized knowledge that none of the others possessed independently. Together, their work transformed decades-old evidence into a successful criminal investigation. By the time John D. Miller entered his guilty plea in 2019, the April Tinsley case had become one of the defining examples of investigative genetic genealogy in the United States. More importantly, it demonstrated that scientific innovation achieves its greatest value not by replacing traditional investigative methods, but by strengthening them. The biological evidence collected in 1988 had never changed. The careful documentation prepared by the original detectives had never changed. The commitment of investigators to solving the case had never changed. What changed was science. And when that science finally reached the point where preserved evidence could reveal what had remained hidden for 30 years, it confirmed a principle that continues to shape modern homicide investigations. A properly preserved crime scene may continue to speak long after witnesses have forgotten, investigators have retired, and decades have passed, waiting only for the moment when technology becomes capable of hearing what the evidence has been saying all along. Following the arrest of John D. Miller in July 2018, the April Tinsley investigation entered its final phase, judicial review. For more than 30 years, detectives had worked to identify the individual responsible for the abduction, sexual assault, and murder of 8-year-old April Tinsley. With a suspect now in custody and supported by forensic evidence, responsibility shifted from investigators to the criminal justice system, where the evidence would be examined according to established legal procedures. The prosecution prepared an extensive evidentiary record. Unlike many homicide cases investigated over a period of months, the April Tinsley investigation spanned more than 3 decades. Prosecutors therefore organized thousands of pages of investigative reports, laboratory findings, witness interviews, crime scene documentation, evidence inventories, and chain of custody records into a comprehensive case file. Every significant event since April 1988 had been documented. The original missing person investigation, the recovery of April's body, the forensic examination, the anonymous communications believed to have originated from the offender, repeated laboratory analyses, periodic cold case reviews, the development of DNA technology, the use of investigative genetic genealogy, the surveillance operation, the confirmatory DNA comparison, the arrest. Each stage demonstrated that the investigation had remained active despite the passage of time. One issue anticipated by prosecutors concerned the age of the evidence. In many criminal cases, defense attorneys examine whether physical evidence has been preserved properly over extended periods. Consequently, chain of custody documentation assumed particular importance in this investigation. The prosecution demonstrated that biological evidence collected during the original investigation had remained under secure control. Transfers between laboratories had been recorded. Storage procedures had been documented. Evidence seals had been maintained. Laboratory analyses followed accepted forensic standards. This continuity strengthened confidence that the DNA evidence analyzed decades later originated from the same material collected in 1988. As court proceedings advanced, forensic experts prepared to explain DNA science to the court. Although DNA profiling had become familiar to many jurors through public awareness and previous criminal trials, prosecutors recognized that the investigation also involved investigative genetic genealogy, a relatively recent investigative technique. Accordingly, legal distinctions were carefully maintained. Investigative genetic genealogy explained how detectives developed a suspect. The admissible scientific evidence centered on traditional forensic DNA comparisons performed by accredited laboratories. This distinction reflected accepted investigative practice. Genealogy generated an investigative lead. Conventional forensic DNA confirmed identity. The prosecution relied upon the latter as scientific evidence supporting the criminal charges. Throughout 2018 and 2019, the case moved through pretrial proceedings. Attorneys addressed procedural matters common in serious criminal prosecutions. Discovery obligations were completed. Expert witnesses were identified. Scientific reports were exchanged. Legal motions were considered by the court. The proceedings reflected the careful preparation required in homicide cases involving complex forensic evidence. Then, in December 2019, a significant development occurred. John D. Miller entered a guilty plea. Rather than proceeding to a jury trial, Miller admitted responsibility for the crimes charged. Under American criminal procedure, a guilty plea requires judicial review to ensure that it is entered knowingly, voluntarily, and supported by an adequate factual basis. The court therefore questioned Miller regarding the plea before formally accepting it. The guilty plea had several immediate consequences. Most importantly, it eliminated the need for a lengthy jury trial during which investigators, forensic scientists, medical experts, and members of April's family would have been required to testify extensively regarding events that occurred more than 30 years earlier. For April's relatives, avoiding a prolonged trial reduced the emotional burden associated with revisiting every detail of the crime in open court. For prosecutors, the plea secured a formal judicial acknowledgement of criminal responsibility without the uncertainties inherent in any jury proceeding. Although the case did not proceed to a contested trial, the investigation itself remained thoroughly documented. The prosecution possessed extensive forensic evidence connecting Miller to the crime. The preserved biological evidence. The DNA comparisons. The investigative chronology. The evidence preservation records. Together, these materials formed the factual basis supporting the criminal proceedings. Following acceptance of the guilty plea, the court scheduled sentencing. In 2020, the Allen County Superior Court imposed an aggregate sentence of 80 years imprisonment. The sentence reflected the seriousness of the offenses and the sentencing framework applicable under Indiana law for crimes committed in 1988. The court's decision formally concluded the criminal prosecution. For investigators, sentencing represented the completion of one of Indiana's longest-running homicide investigations. For April Tinsley's family, however, the conclusion carried a different meaning. No judicial proceeding could reverse the events of April 1988. The loss of an 8-year-old child remained permanent. What the criminal justice system could provide was accountability established through evidence, judicial process, and lawful conviction. During public statements following the resolution of the case, law enforcement officials repeatedly emphasized the importance of persistence. Many of the original detectives who responded to April's disappearance in 1988 were no longer actively involved in the investigation by the time of Miller's guilty plea. Some had retired. Others had transferred to different assignments. New investigators inherited the case, reviewed historical evidence, embraced emerging forensic technologies, and continued pursuing answers long after the original investigation might reasonably have been expected to end. The investigation, therefore, became an example of institutional continuity rather than individual accomplishment. Each generation of investigators preserved the work completed by those who came before. Crime scene technicians protected evidence. Property custodians maintained chain of custody records. Laboratory scientists adopted increasingly sophisticated analytical methods. Cold case detectives reviewed historical files repeatedly. Genealogists reconstructed biological relationships. Surveillance officers obtained confirmatory evidence. Prosecutors organized decades of investigative work into a legally sustainable criminal case. No single development solved the investigation independently. Success resulted from the cumulative efforts of numerous professionals working across 3 decades. The judicial resolution also influenced public understanding of investigative genetic genealogy. Media coverage frequently described the case as one solved through genealogy. Law enforcement officials clarified that genealogy had been an investigative tool rather than the courtroom evidence supporting conviction. This distinction became increasingly important as additional jurisdictions considered using investigative genetic genealogy in other cold case investigations. The April Tinsley case demonstrated an effective investigative sequence. Preserve evidence. Develop a reliable forensic DNA profile. Attempt conventional database comparisons. Use investigative genetic genealogy when appropriate to generate leads. Verify those leads through traditional police investigation. Confirm identity through standard forensic DNA analysis. Present admissible evidence through established judicial procedures. This structured approach soon became widely recognized as the appropriate framework for integrating genealogy into criminal investigation. The resolution of the case also reinforced confidence in long-term evidence preservation. The biological evidence collected in 1988 remained scientifically valuable because investigators had preserved it according to accepted forensic standards, despite the technological limitations of the period. Without that preservation, the guilty plea entered in 2019 would almost certainly have been impossible. The April Tinsley investigation thus concluded not only with the conviction of the person legally responsible for her murder, but also with a broader demonstration of how science, meticulous documentation, and decades of investigative persistence can work together within the criminal justice system. What had begun as one of Indiana's most heartbreaking unsolved child homicides ultimately became one of the clearest examples of how modern forensic science can transform preserved evidence into courtroom accountability, even after more than 30 years have passed. The resolution of the murder of April Tinsley quickly became recognized as more than the successful conclusion of a single cold case. Within law enforcement, forensic science, and the legal community, the investigation demonstrated that decades-old biological evidence, when properly preserved and combined with emerging scientific methods, could fundamentally change what investigators believed was possible. Alongside several other high-profile cases solved during the same period, the April Tinsley investigation became an important milestone in the modern history of cold case investigations in the United States. Before 2018, many homicide detectives viewed certain cold cases as having reached the practical limits of available forensic science. Evidence had been collected. Witnesses had been interviewed. Traditional investigative leads had been exhausted. DNA profiles had been entered into CODIS. Repeated comparisons had produced no matches. Investigators often continued reviewing these cases periodically, but expectations for a breakthrough remained uncertain. The emergence of investigative genetic genealogy changed that assessment. Instead of relying exclusively upon criminal justice databases, investigators now possessed an additional investigative option when preserved biological evidence was available. The April Tinsley investigation demonstrated how this option could be applied responsibly. Importantly, law enforcement agencies emphasized that investigative genetic genealogy was not appropriate for every criminal investigation. Several conditions generally needed to exist. The crime had to be sufficiently serious, typically involving homicide or sexual assault. Reliable biological evidence had to be preserved. Laboratories had to generate DNA data suitable for genealogical comparison. Traditional investigative methods, including CODIS searches, had to be exhausted. Only then would agencies consider whether genealogical analysis might be justified under applicable policies and legal standards. The April Tinsley case satisfied these conditions. The homicide involved an 8-year-old child. Biological evidence collected in 1988 had been carefully preserved. Conventional forensic DNA analysis had already produced a reliable offender profile. Repeated database searches had failed to identify the source of that DNA. Genealogical analysis, therefore, became a logical next step rather than a replacement for traditional investigation. Law enforcement training programs soon began incorporating the investigation into instructional materials. Detectives studying cold case methodology examined how investigators preserved evidence over 3 decades. Crime scene technicians reviewed the importance of meticulous biological evidence collection. Forensic scientists studied the progression from early serological testing to modern DNA analysis. Genealogists analyzed the reconstruction of extended family relationships. Prosecutors examined how emerging investigative methods could be integrated into established evidentiary frameworks. Each professional discipline found practical lessons within the investigation. Evidence preservation became one of the most frequently discussed topics. When April's murder occurred in 1988, investigators could not anticipate the scientific techniques that would exist 30 years later. Nevertheless, they collected biological material according to accepted forensic procedures. Property custodians maintained secure storage. Laboratories documented every examination. Chain of custody records remained complete. Because every stage of evidence management had been carefully documented, later investigators could apply advanced analytical methods with confidence. The case therefore reinforced a principle already familiar to experienced homicide investigators. Evidence should never be discarded simply because current technology appears unable to analyze it fully. Scientific capability changes continuously. Material considered insignificant during one decade may become critically important during another. The April Tinsley investigation provided a compelling demonstration of that reality. The investigation also encouraged many agencies to re-examine older homicide evidence. Across the United States, police departments and state investigative agencies began reviewing unsolved cases involving preserved biological material. Cold case units conducted evidence inventories. Laboratories reassessed previously tested samples. Detectives identified investigations in which modern DNA analysis or investigative genetic genealogy might produce new leads. Some agencies created specialized teams dedicated exclusively to reviewing long unsolved violent crimes. Others expanded cooperation with forensic laboratories and professional genealogists. The influence of the investigation therefore extended well beyond Indiana. Another significant lesson involved interdisciplinary cooperation. Successful resolution of the April Tinsley investigation required expertise from multiple professional fields. Crime scene investigators preserved evidence. Forensic biologists developed DNA profiles. Laboratory scientists performed advanced genetic analysis. Professional genealogists reconstructed family trees. Cold case detectives evaluated investigative leads. Surveillance officers obtained confirmatory DNA. Prosecutors organized the evidence for criminal proceedings. Each discipline depended upon the others. The investigation demonstrated that modern homicide investigations increasingly require collaboration rather than isolated expertise. Legal scholars likewise examined the investigation. Because investigative genetic genealogy represented a relatively recent investigative development, attorneys and judges considered how it fit within existing constitutional principles, evidentiary rules, and privacy considerations. The April Tinsley investigation illustrated an important distinction. Genealogical research itself did not establish guilt. Rather, it generated an investigative lead. The evidence supporting criminal prosecution consisted of conventional forensic DNA analysis performed according to accepted laboratory standards, together with additional investigative findings. This distinction helped shape legal discussions concerning the appropriate role of genealogy within criminal investigations. Public understanding of forensic science also evolved. Media coverage often described the investigation as a DNA breakthrough. While broadly accurate, investigators repeatedly explained that the success depended upon much more than laboratory technology alone. Without meticulous crime scene documentation in 1988, there would have been no biological evidence to analyze. Without careful evidence preservation, DNA testing would have been impossible decades later. Without genealogical research, investigators might never have identified a viable suspect. Without surveillance and independent DNA confirmation, prosecutors would have lacked the forensic evidence necessary for criminal charges. Science succeeded because each investigative component functioned together. The investigation further demonstrated the importance of institutional memory. Cold cases frequently outlast individual investigators. Detectives retire. Laboratory personnel change. Supervisors assume new assignments. Unless investigative records are carefully maintained, valuable knowledge can disappear over time. In the April Tinsley investigation, however, successive generations of investigators inherited comprehensive documentation prepared by those who came before them. Every interview, every laboratory report, every crime scene photograph, every evidence transfer, and every investigative decision. Together, these records preserve the history of the investigation across more than 3 decades. For April Tinsley's family, the broader scientific significance of the case existed alongside a much more personal reality. The identification of the person responsible for April's murder answered questions that had remained unresolved since 1988. Although no judicial outcome could undo the crime itself, the investigation demonstrated that persistent investigative effort combined with scientific progress could ultimately produce accountability even after decades of uncertainty. Within forensic science, the case continues to be cited because it illustrates the gradual evolution of investigative capability. The biological evidence collected in 1988 did not become more informative because it changed. Rather, science developed methods capable of extracting information that investigators could not previously obtain. This distinction remains central to understanding modern forensic investigation. Evidence often contains more information than contemporary technology can reveal. Future scientific advances may simply provide new ways of interpreting what has always been present. The April Tinsley investigation therefore occupies an important place in the history of modern criminal investigation. It confirmed that properly preserved evidence can retain investigative value across generations. It demonstrated the practical integration of investigative genetic genealogy into established police procedures. It reinforced the importance of interdisciplinary cooperation. And it encouraged law enforcement agencies throughout the United States to revisit long unsolved homicides with renewed optimism that scientific progress might finally answer questions that had remained unresolved for decades. By the time John D. Miller pleaded guilty in December 2019 and was sentenced in 2020, the murder of April Tinsley had become far more than a solved homicide investigation. Within the criminal justice community, it had become a case study illustrating how perseverance, scientific advancement, and meticulous evidence preservation could work together across generations. Detectives, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and policymakers began examining the investigation not only because it achieved justice after more than 30 years, but because it demonstrated a model that could be applied to hundreds of other unsolved violent crimes. For many investigators, the most important lesson was surprisingly simple. A cold case is not necessarily a dead case. Historically, the term cold case often suggested an investigation that had reached a practical dead end. Every witness had been interviewed, every obvious suspect had been investigated, every available forensic technique had been exhausted. The passage of time appeared to reduce the likelihood that the crime would ever be solved. The April Tinsley investigation challenged that assumption. The biological evidence collected in 1988 never lost its value. What changed was science. As forensic technology evolved, the same evidence produced increasingly detailed information. The DNA profile became more complete. Analytical methods became more sensitive. Eventually, entirely new investigative techniques emerged that allowed detectives to identify a suspect without requiring a direct match in a criminal DNA database. This concept has fundamentally reshaped how many agencies manage unsolved homicides. Instead of viewing cold cases as investigations that have ended, many departments now regard them as investigations waiting for new opportunities. Those opportunities may arise from improved forensic technology, new witness information, previously unavailable records, advances in digital analysis, or scientific methods that have yet to be developed. The April Tinsley case demonstrated that patience and preservation can be as valuable as immediate investigative breakthroughs. The investigation also reinforced the importance of evidence management. Crime scene investigators are frequently reminded that every item collected today may possess future scientific value beyond current technological capabilities. Consequently, modern forensic training places enormous emphasis on proper collection, packaging, storage, and documentation. Biological samples, clothing, fibers, hair, touch DNA, digital evidence. Every category of evidence is preserved with the understanding that future laboratory techniques may reveal information unavailable today. The April Tinsley investigation is often cited as a practical example of why these standards matter. Had investigators failed to preserve biological evidence in 1988, no amount of scientific progress during the following 30 years could have identified the offender. The case also highlighted the value of periodic cold case review. Many agencies now maintain dedicated cold case units whose primary responsibility is not simply to investigate new leads, but to reassess historical investigations in light of changing technology. These reviews often involve multidisciplinary teams. The detectives examine investigative files. Forensic scientists evaluate preserved evidence. Laboratories determine whether additional testing is feasible. Crime analysts reconstruct timelines. Genealogists may assist when biological evidence supports investigative genetic genealogy. Rather than beginning an investigation from the beginning, these reviews build upon decades of accumulated investigative work. Institutional continuity became another defining lesson. Few homicide investigations remain active for more than 3 decades without significant personnel changes. Detectives retire. Laboratory personnel accept new assignments. Supervisors change. Administrative structures evolve. Unless investigative records are carefully maintained, valuable institutional knowledge can disappear. The April Tinsley investigation demonstrated the opposite. Every generation of investigators inherited detailed documentation prepared by those who came before. Original crime scene photographs remained available. Evidence inventories were complete. Laboratory reports had been preserved. Witness interviews were organized. Investigative decisions had been documented. This continuity allowed modern investigators to understand precisely what had occurred in 1988 without repeating work already completed. The investigation also influenced forensic education, police academies, crime scene training programs, university forensic science departments, professional conferences, legal education seminars. Each began using the case to illustrate different aspects of modern criminal investigation. For crime scene technicians, the lessons centered on evidence preservation. For laboratory scientists, it demonstrated the evolution of DNA technology. For detectives, it illustrated long-term investigative persistence. For prosecutors, it emphasized the importance of distinguishing investigative leads from admissible evidence. For genealogists, it provided one of the earliest high-profile demonstrations of investigative genetic genealogy operating within established legal procedures. Legal and ethical discussions likewise expanded following the case. As investigative genetic genealogy became more widely used, policymakers examined questions involving privacy, informed consent, database participation, and appropriate investigative limitations. Different genealogy databases adopted varying policies concerning law enforcement access. Professional organizations developed recommendations governing when investigative genetic genealogy should be used and what safeguards should accompany its application. Although these policy discussions continue to evolve, the April Tinsley investigation consistently serves as an example of genealogy functioning as an investigative tool rather than a substitute for courtroom evidence. This distinction remains critically important. The genealogical analysis did not establish criminal responsibility. It identified a possible suspect. Traditional surveillance produced an independent DNA sample. Conventional forensic DNA analysis confirmed the match. Investigators reviewed additional evidence. The judicial process evaluated the case according to established legal standards. Each step remained subject to independent verification. The investigation further demonstrated the enduring importance of interdisciplinary cooperation. Modern homicide investigations increasingly depend upon specialists working together. Crime scene investigators preserve evidence. Forensic biologists analyze DNA. Genealogists reconstruct family relationships. Detectives evaluate investigative leads. Surveillance teams obtain corroborating evidence. Prosecutors prepare legal proceedings. Judges ensure procedural fairness. No individual discipline alone solved the April Tinsley investigation. Success resulted from their combined efforts. Perhaps the investigation's most enduring legacy, however, lies in the message it sends to families whose loved ones remain victims of unsolved violent crime. Cold case investigators frequently acknowledge that scientific progress cannot guarantee resolution. Some investigations lack preserved biological evidence. Others involve insufficient documentation. Many continue to present extraordinary challenges despite advancing technology. Nevertheless, the April Tinsley investigation demonstrated that the passage of time alone does not eliminate the possibility of accountability. Evidence preserved carefully today may answer questions decades later. Investigative methods continue improving. Laboratory science continues evolving. New analytical tools continue emerging. For law enforcement agencies across North America, the case reaffirmed a commitment that many detectives have long expressed. As long as evidence exists, a homicide investigation retains the possibility of progress. The murder of April Tinsley, therefore, became more than a solved crime. It became a reminder that justice sometimes advances at the pace of science rather than the pace of the calendar. More than 30 years separated the collection of the critical biological evidence from the identification of the individual responsible. Yet throughout those decades, the evidence remained unchanged. It waited. Investigators preserved it. Scientists developed new methods. Genealogists uncovered biological connections. Detectives followed the leads. The courts evaluated the evidence. Together, those efforts transformed one of Indiana's most heartbreaking unsolved child homicides into one of the defining examples of how modern forensic science can illuminate the past and deliver answers that once seemed permanently beyond reach. The murder of April Tinsley remains one of the most extensively studied cold case investigations in modern American law enforcement, not only because it was solved after more than 3 decades, but because nearly every stage of the investigation offers practical lessons for investigators, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and criminal justice researchers. Rather than being remembered solely as a tragic homicide, the case has become an example of how careful investigative practice can preserve opportunities that future scientific advances may eventually unlock. One of the clearest lessons concerns the importance of the initial crime scene response. When investigators first began searching for April after she disappeared on April 1st, 1988, they had no way of knowing that the investigation would remain active for more than 30 years. Officers, detectives, crime scene technicians, and forensic specialists nevertheless approached the case according to established homicide protocols. Every potential piece of evidence was documented. Photographs recorded the condition of the recovery site. Measurements were taken. Physical evidence was collected. Chain of custody documentation began immediately. These procedures reflected accepted investigative standards rather than any prediction about future technological developments. Yet those early decisions ultimately became one of the investigation's greatest strengths. Modern crime scene training continues emphasizing the same principle. Investigators rarely know which item of evidence will eventually prove decisive. Consequently, comprehensive evidence collection remains essential, even when the immediate investigative value of particular items appears uncertain. The April Tinsley investigation illustrates why. Biological material collected in 1988 could not be analyzed using investigative genetic genealogy because the technique did not yet exist. Nevertheless, preserving that evidence allowed future investigators to apply technologies developed decades later. Another important lesson concerns documentation. Throughout the investigation, detectives produced detailed reports describing witness interviews, search activities, laboratory requests, investigative decisions, and evidence transfers. At the time those reports were written, they served ordinary investigative purposes. 30 years later, they performed an entirely different function. They allowed new investigators, many of whom had not yet begun their law enforcement careers in 1988, to understand precisely what had occurred during every stage of the original investigation. Without comprehensive documentation, institutional knowledge gradually disappears. Experienced investigators retire. Memories fade. Personnel change. Written records become the only reliable source of historical investigative information. The April Tinsley case demonstrated how thorough documentation preserves investigative continuity across generations. Evidence management, likewise, became a defining feature of the investigation. Maintaining biological evidence for more than 3 decades requires strict adherence to evidence control procedures. Property custodians documented transfers. Laboratories recorded examinations. Storage conditions were maintained according to accepted forensic standards. Each individual responsible for handling the evidence contributed to its long-term integrity. The successful use of that evidence decades later reflected the cumulative effect of countless routine administrative decisions made consistently over many years. The investigation also illustrates the gradual evolution of forensic science itself. When April was murdered in 1988, DNA profiling remained in its early stages of forensic application. Many laboratories relied primarily upon serological testing, blood group analysis, and other techniques far less discriminating than modern DNA profiling. As molecular biology advanced during the following decades, laboratories developed increasingly sophisticated methods capable of generating reliable DNA profiles from smaller biological samples. Later, improvements in sequencing technology and computational analysis expanded investigative possibilities even further. The evidence remained constant. Scientific capability changed. This distinction is central to understanding the investigation's historical significance. Another major lesson concerns the relationship between science and detective work. Popular portrayals of forensic investigation sometimes suggest that laboratory technology alone solves criminal cases. The April Tinsley investigation demonstrates a more accurate reality. Science generated information. Detectives interpreted that information. Genealogists reconstructed family relationships. Surveillance officers obtained confirmatory evidence. Prosecutors organized the resulting case. No scientific technique independently identified, arrested, prosecuted, and convicted the offender. Every stage required professional judgment and coordinated investigative effort. The investigation therefore illustrates that forensic science functions most effectively when integrated with traditional investigative practice rather than replacing it. The role of investigative genetic genealogy further reinforces this principle. Public discussion often describes the case as one solved by genealogy. In practice, genealogy served a much narrower investigative purpose. It generated a lead. The lead identified a possible suspect based upon biological relationships inferred from DNA and historical family records. Detectives then conducted a conventional criminal investigation. They verified historical information. They performed surveillance. They lawfully recovered discarded biological material. They submitted that material for standard forensic DNA comparison. Only after obtaining an independent forensic match did investigators proceed with arrest. This sequence has become widely recognized as the appropriate investigative model. Genealogy generates investigative direction. Traditional investigation confirms the results. The case also emphasizes the importance of maintaining investigative flexibility. During the original investigation, detectives pursued every reasonable lead available under the technology of the late 1980s. As new scientific methods became available during the 1990s and early 2000s, investigators revisited preserved evidence. When investigative genetic genealogy emerged as a practical option decades later, the case was reviewed again. Investigators adapted to changing scientific capability without abandoning established investigative standards. Such flexibility remains essential in modern homicide investigations because forensic technology continues developing rapidly. Future investigative methods may differ substantially from those available today. Interagency cooperation represented another significant factor. The successful resolution of the investigation required collaboration among local law enforcement, the Indiana State Police, forensic laboratories, prosecutors, and specialists in investigative genetic genealogy. Each organization contributed expertise unavailable within the others. Modern cold case investigations increasingly rely upon this collaborative model because complex forensic investigations often extend beyond the resources of any single agency. The April Tinsley case also reinforced the value of public communication. Throughout the investigation, law enforcement periodically sought assistance from the public while carefully protecting information known only to investigators. Photographs of April remained in circulation. Media organizations reported major investigative developments. Anniversary coverage reminded the public that the investigation remained active. At the same time, detectives deliberately withheld certain details that could later assist in evaluating confessions or identifying individuals possessing undisclosed knowledge of the crime. Balancing transparency with investigative confidentiality remains a fundamental principle of homicide investigation. Finally, the case demonstrates the importance of long-term institutional commitment. Many criminal investigations conclude quickly because suspects are identified soon after the offense. Cold cases demand a different type of persistence. Evidence must be preserved indefinitely. Files must remain accessible. Laboratories must retain records. Investigators must periodically reassess the evidence as technology advances. Administrative support must continue despite the passage of years. The April Tinsley investigation succeeded because each generation of professionals accepted responsibility for preserving the work completed by those before them. From the initial search conducted in April 1988 to the guilty plea entered more than 30 years later, the investigation reflected continuity rather than isolated moments of success. Every careful report, every properly sealed evidence package, every laboratory analysis, every cold case review, every technological advancement. Together, they formed a chain of investigative effort extending across 3 decades. The case therefore stands as one of the clearest demonstrations that justice in cold case investigations often depends not upon a single dramatic breakthrough, but upon thousands of careful, methodical decisions made consistently over many years, decisions that preserve the possibility that when science finally catches up with the evidence, investigators will still be ready to hear what it has to say. More than 3 decades separated the day 8-year-old April Marie Tinsley disappeared from her Fort Wayne neighborhood and the day the criminal justice system formally established responsibility for her murder. During those years, forensic science changed dramatically, investigative methods evolved, and generations of detectives devoted portions of their careers to a case that many feared might never be solved. Yet throughout every stage of the investigation, one fact remained unchanged. At the center of the case was a young child whose life ended far too soon. Historical accounts of major criminal investigations often focus on offenders, forensic breakthroughs, and courtroom proceedings. The April Tinsley investigation serves as a reminder that the purpose of every homicide investigation extends beyond identifying a suspect. The ultimate objective is to establish the truth surrounding the death of the victim, preserve the integrity of the evidence, and provide lawful accountability through the criminal justice system. April disappeared on April 1st, SIL 1988. Within hours, family members, neighbors, volunteers, and law enforcement officers began searching throughout the surrounding community. Search teams checked streets, parks, vacant lots, wooded areas, fields, public spaces. Residents distributed flyers. Local media interrupted regular programming. Police agencies coordinated search efforts. The investigation expanded rapidly because of the victim's age and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. When April's body was discovered 3 days later in DeKalb County, the investigation shifted from a missing child search to a homicide investigation. For investigators, every subsequent decision reflected that change. The recovery scene became a carefully documented crime scene. Evidence was collected systematically. The medical examination sought to determine the cause and manner of death while documenting injuries relevant to the criminal investigation. Witnesses were interviewed repeatedly. Timelines were reconstructed. Investigators attempted